colonial de Puerto Rico, Puerto Rico Colonial Conundrum. Es el lema bajo el cual los hemos convocado esta mañana. La mayor parte de ustedes conoce a CNE por su trabajo en el ámbito económico. En el área de política pública, los temas de energía, reconstrucción, vivienda, deuda pública o programas federales. ¿Qué hace CNE abordando el tema del estatus, dirán ustedes? La respuesta es que el estatus es para Puerto Rico el marco dentro del cual se forja la política económica. Y durante los últimos años, CNE ha visto que las posibilidades de forjar alternativas económicas para la isla son limitadas por la situación política de Puerto Rico. Los obstáculos que enfrenta la isla para forjar alternativas no pueden ser desligadas del estatus, de la relación de Puerto Rico con Estados Unidos y de la relación de Puerto Rico con el resto del mundo. La revocación de la sección 936 del Código de Rentas Internas Federal, la desestimación de la quiebra criolla, el nombramiento de una junta de supervisión fiscal, el caso Baello Madero sobre el seguro social suplementario, las dispensas a la ley Jones para las barcazas del gas natural, los fondos para reparar los daños de los huracanes, son solamente algunos ejemplos que le han mostrado a CNE en años recientes que la caja de herramientas con las que cuenta Puerto Rico para establecer una nueva agenda de desarrollo económico sostenible y equitativo, basado en elementos endógenos, se nos ha ido vaciando. Y que es preciso identificar y diseñar nuevos instrumentos. A la misma vez que el tema del estatus ha hecho patente para nosotros su relación con el tema económico, hemos visto una especie de anquilosamiento, de estancamiento sobre las posibilidades de solución de este tema, tanto a nivel local como a nivel federal. Se hablan alternativas, se genera algún momentum a nivel público y luego el asunto se hace sal y agua y se disipa hasta el próximo ciclo electoral. Hay otras formas de pensar el estatus de Puerto Rico. Otras formas de mirarlo para identificar marcos teóricos, procesos alternos fuera del impasse actual. Estamos conscientes que este es un tema que levanta pasiones. Por eso hemos querido abordarlo fuera de líneas partidistas o ideologías, desde un punto de vista sobrio, ponderado y académico. En el Buró de CNE de Madrid nos dedicamos a mirar otras formas de cómo abordar los problemas de Puerto Rico. Observamos la forma en que las sociedades al otro lado del Atlántico dan respuestas a problemas comunes. El precio de la electricidad, el gasto público, la deuda, la sanidad, para tratar entonces de aportar nuevos enfoques a los dilemas que enfrenta la isla actualmente. El estatus de Puerto Rico es uno de estos temas. Hemos hecho una asociación con el doctor Jaime Yuch, profesor de la Universidad de Puerto Rico y científico político reconocido internacionalmente. Le invitamos a que convocara a un grupo de académicos de calibre internacional para discutir el dilema del estatus de Puerto Rico desde una perspectiva comparativista. Vamos a hablar sobre Cataluña, Córcega, Quebec y Escocia para tratar de derivar lecciones para Puerto Rico durante esta mañana. Como vamos a ver durante el transcurso de esta actividad, España, Francia, Italia y el Reino Unido pueden ser consideradas, al igual quizás que Estados Unidos, democracias multinacionales, sociedades que han incorporado regiones o grupos étnicos a través de uniones dinásticas, incorporaciones territoriales o conquistas. Estas comunidades políticas multiétnicas varían en sus estructuras constitucionales y en las oportunidades o limitaciones que presentan sus instituciones para acomodar la diversidad. Algunos lo han hecho a través de sistemas federales, otros a través de estatutos autonómicos, otros a través de la creación de regiones especiales. Pensamos que examinar estos casos puede arrojar luz sobre el dilema de Puerto Rico y sobre el dilema que tiene Estados Unidos con Puerto Rico, para iluminar tal vez algún tipo de proceso, dinámica o vía que quizás no hemos considerado hasta el momento. Este tipo de enfoque comparativo o comparativista es común en círculos académicos. Nos pareció importante, sin embargo, traerla a un público más amplio. Por eso los hemos convocado a ustedes, un grupo de diversas posturas, para pensar juntos o junto a nosotros enfoques frescos al dilema del estatus. ¿Qué podemos aprender de otras sociedades que tienen dilemas similares? Esta será una conversación novedosa para nosotros en CNE y esperamos que resulte novedosa o al menos interesante para ustedes también. Nuestros ponentes han venido de lejos. El profesor Smith y el profesor LeCour han atravesado el continente americano, mientras que los profesores McEwen, Argela Guet, López Bofil y Fassi han cruzado el Atlántico para estar con nosotros esta mañana. En sus asientos hemos dejado unas tarjetas con un código QR que pueden utilizar para conocer más a fondo la biografía de nuestros ponentes y ver el programa completo. No vamos a hacer receso entre los paneles, pueden pasar por la mesa de los refrigerios en cualquier momento, pero como vamos a estar grabando, le pedimos que lo haga por los laterales para no interrumpir la grabación. Vamos a comenzar el programa. Puerto Rico y el paradigma de las democracias multinacionales. ¿Qué quiere decir esto y por qué mirar el dilema del estatus de Puerto Rico desde esta perspectiva? Para ello vamos a contar con el doctor Jaime Yuch, profesor de Ciencias Políticas de la Universidad de Puerto Rico y convocante de esta conferencia, quien va a romper el hielo de esta mañana conversando con Sergio Marzuach, director de Política Pública del Centro para una Nueva Economía, sobre el marco conceptual que nos está proponiendo. El profesor Yuch es un comparativista reconocido internacionalmente, es autor de publicaciones premiadas e investiga las formas en que las sociedades o las democracias multinacionales acomodan constitucional y políticamente la diversidad nacional. Vamos a dar paso a esta conversación inicial. Adelante.
Buenos días a todos. Gracias por estar aquí con nosotros. Muy especial a todos los ponentes que vinieron de tan lejos para estar aquí en la mañana de hoy. Y muy especial también a todo el equipo de trabajo del Centro para la Nueva Economía, que fueron los que nos ayudaron a montar todo este cero. Muchas gracias. Jaime. Buenos días, Jaime.
Un placer estar aquí contigo. Y me parece un lugar maravilloso el que estamos viendo aquí.
Pues Jaime, vamos a empezar un poco a tratar.
Déjame empezar primero dándole las gracias al Centro de la Nueva Economía, porque realmente un evento como este es pionero en Puerto Rico, por no decir histórico, y es verdaderamente innovador. Y nosotros en la academia se supone que innovemos también y creemos nuevas ideas, nuevas teorías, nuevos conceptos y nuevos conocimientos. En ese sentido, como vemos en la primera transparencia, esto es una especie de partnership, una sociedad entre el Centro para la Nueva Economía y la academia y éxito.
Pues muy bien. Parte de nuestra misión hoy en este panel, en este conversatorio, es tratar de definir algunos términos, ¿verdad? Y dar como un pequeño bosquejo de las presentaciones que van a venir en el futuro. Como ustedes saben, y como mencionó Jennifer, tradicionalmente estas actividades en Puerto Rico pues tienen un formato estándar. Se trae un representante del Estado Libre Asociado, un representante de la Independencia, un representante de la estadidad y tal vez algún representante de alguna cuarta opción.
Sí.
Y hemos estado envueltos en ese mismo formato por 40, 50 años, dándole vueltas a los mismos términos, a los mismos conceptos, y entendemos que el debate está como un poco estancado, anquilosado, y lo que estamos tratando de buscar es, pues, cómo podemos traer otro lente, otra perspectiva a analizar este asunto. Entonces, en la primera laminilla que tiene Jaime aquí, pues, uno de sus puntos es que, pues, hay 4 paradigmas clásicos que Jaime entiende son los que se han utilizado para analizar la realidad de Puerto Rico. ¿Puedes explicarlo, Jaime?
Sergio, tú habrás ido en los últimos 30 o 40 años, habrás ido a muchas conferencias sobre Puerto Rico, me imagino. Sí. En Estados Unidos y aquí, en Europa también, no sé dónde. Y la verdad es que, si recuerdas algunas de esas conferencias, creo que tú y yo estaríamos de acuerdo. vamos a llamarlo paradigma, ¿no? ¿Qué paradigma usualmente se usan para analizar Puerto Rico? Bueno, el primero, bueno, tú y yo somos abogados, ¿verdad?
Sí.
O sea que no tenemos ningún problema con los abogados, de verdad. Pero la verdad es que el primer paradigma que se usa a menudo es lo que podemos llamar el paradigma de los casos insulares, ¿ok? Que es la idea importante, ¿no? Y todos estos paradigmas son importantes y no los vamos a mente. El derecho constitucional estadounidense es la ley y bajo el sistema actual, ¿no?
Sí.
De dominación, como quieras llamarlo, es la ley y no se puede obviar, pero es unidimensional. Uno de los problemas que yo veo con ese paradigma es que es autorreferencial hasta cierto punto. Este es el derecho y es como un paradigma que no progresa mucho. Si tú fuiste a la conferencia de Yale Law School 1998, famosa,
Sí.
Foreign in a Domestic Sense, que de ahí salió un libro, tremenda conferencia, tremendo libro, pero eso fue hace ya 20 y pico de años. Y si vamos a otra conferencia quizás este año, el año que viene, vas a ver que es más o menos lo...
Más o menos el mismo análisis, se presenta el mismo tipo de paper.
Sí.
Y la crítica que tú haces viene pues básicamente de la escuela de Critical Legal Studies de Estados Unidos, que el derecho es una herramienta, ¿verdad?, incompleta, algo, como se dice en inglés, blunt, para trabajar con un problema que es bastante sutil. O sea que ese paradigma, estoy de acuerdo, es el que ha dominado, especialmente en Puerto Rico, la discusión, y tiene pues unas ventajas y desventajas que tú mencionas, pero el universo de casos se limita solamente a la jurisdicción americana.
Así que ese es uno. Queremos que no lo vamos a descartar, importantísimo ese paradigma, y arriba los abogados, pero yo creo que podemos progresar un poco.
Pasamos al
El
próximo.
segundo paradigma es el que podríamos llamar el American Politics Paradigm, para decirlo en inglés. Y es la idea, y esto es un tema importante en Estados Unidos, hay mucha gente que estudia política de Estados Unidos. En ese paradigma yo creo que la idea es que Puerto Rico es simplemente otro grupo racial y étnico en Estados Unidos. O sea que no hay gran diferencia entre los coreanos americanos, los Mexican Americans, African Americans, Asian Americans, y la realidad social, cultural, lingüística de esta isla. Porque otra cosa es que como a mí me ha pasado toda mi vida, que he estado viviendo mitad de mi vida fuera de Puerto Rico, y cuando yo estoy en Connecticut, en New Haven, Connecticut, o en donde sea, Washington, D.C., pues ahí sí yo soy una minoría, me ven a mí como una minoría racial y étnica, irrespectivo de lo que yo pienso de mí mismo. O sea, irrespectivo de lo que yo pienso, ellos dicen, bueno, tú eres racial y étnicamente distinto. Ese paradigma está equivocado para analizar Puerto Rico. Eso es incorrecto, en mi opinión. Así que ese también lo podemos, yo creo que, pasar para adelante.
Sí. El paradigma de la colonia clásica, que yo creo que es uno de los que más se estudia y se comenta y discute en Puerto Rico. Tú también tienes unos señalamientos que quisieras hacer.
Este tercero a mí me gusta mucho, de verdad, me persuade en muchas dimensiones. Este tercero es, y es muy útil, igual que los anteriores, pero este especialmente. Este tercero es la idea de que Puerto Rico, por razones reales, ¿no? Ha sido colonizado 2 veces, back-to-back colonialism, como dirían en inglés. Y algunos dirían que hay muchos elementos de colonialismo todavía en la realidad de esta isla hoy en día. Así que es un paradigma importante. Sin embargo, yo creo que realmente para analizar la realidad política hoy en día del siglo XXI de Puerto Rico, también tiene sus limitaciones, porque yo no veo hoy en día a Puerto Rico como una colonia clásica tipo Mozambique, tipo Angola, tipo la India en 1930. Yo creo que sí tiene algo de elementos de colonialismo, no hay duda, pero es una colonia un poco distinta, así que tiene su utilidad limitada. Yo también diría que podemos ir un poquito más adelante.
Okay, Jaime, pero vamos a parar aquí un momentito porque este es el que tiende a dominar la discusión. De verdad, ¿en qué sentido tú crees que Puerto Rico no cabe dentro de este paradigma clásico de una colonia tradicional?
Casi de los tres, el primero yo creo que es importante, el derecho, y yo soy abogado, 12 años practiqué, y hay que reconocerlo. El segundo está equivocado. Este tercero es importante, explica mucho de la historia, de la trayectoria histórica de Puerto Rico, pero lo que quizás quiero decir es que para entender la realidad política, sobre todo la política de Puerto Rico hoy en día, hay otro paradigma, que es el nuestro, que es el que vamos a hablar, que yo creo que explica nos ayuda a entender más cosas de Puerto Rico. Yo creo que este paradigma colonial se ha vuelto casi como una etiqueta, un label, una etiqueta, y se ha vuelto como algo casi que uno arroja cuando uno quiere decir, bueno, es una colonia. Así que yo creo que podemos trascender este paradigma, y el paradigma que vamos a hablar dentro de unos minutos me parece que nos ayuda más, pero no, insisto que es importante. En todo caso, sabes que yo creo que académicamente, y esto es para los profesores de la UPR, yo creo que hace falta mejores libros que analicen, porque yo no los he visto, qué tipo de colonialismo realmente es Puerto Rico. O sea, desde el punto de vista de análisis comparativo histórico, sinceramente yo no he visto buenas publicaciones todavía, así que quién sabe si eso es un proyecto mío en los próximos 20 años.
Okay. Entonces pasamos al próximo y último paradigma, que es el de comparar a Puerto Rico en el contexto de América Latina.
Bien, este cuarto, hay un campo que se llama Latin American Politics, que realmente yo diría que se inventó en Estados Unidos y se promueve mucho en las reuniones anuales de LASA, Latin American Studies Association. También tiene algo de, como dice en inglés, grain of truth, ¿no? Tiene cierta verdad incluida dentro de este paradigma. Y es que obviamente Puerto Rico, bueno, viene de la historia que tenemos, 1493 en adelante, hasta culturalmente tiene mucho que ver con República Dominicana, con Cuba, hasta con Colombia y todo eso. Pero yo creo también que a estas alturas Puerto Rico es una entidad política muy distinta a Uruguay, a El Salvador, a Costa Rica. Yo lo veo bien distinto. Este paradigma tiene de nuevo su utilidad, pero yo creo que también es limitada. O sea, yo creo como los anteriores, yo creo que es algo que podemos, o sea, no estamos descartando ninguno.
Correcto, sí.
Todos están ahí.
Sí.
Lo que queremos es innovar, de hecho, que es lo que hace el CNE todo el tiempo. Y yo creo que esta conferencia es eso, innovar, pero en el campo político.
Sí. Pues entonces vamos a pasar a cuál es tu visión, tu perspectiva sobre cuál debería ser el paradigma para estudiar.
El nuevo paradigma, la novedad, pueden poner música así de tambores. La novedad es que bueno, primero, antes de eso, debemos de decir que para mejor apreciar este paradigma, en términos académicos deberíamos de apreciar que hay unas disciplinas que nos ayudan a entender este nuevo paradigma. La primera disciplina es la disciplina de la política comparada, que, ¿verdad? Yo vivo en esto los últimos 23 años, pero para las personas de comunes y corrientes será una novedad que existe una disciplina llamada política comparada. Se dedica a comparar fenómenos políticos, literalmente, o sea, y es una disciplina un poco antinatural, porque la tendencia natural del ser humano es a pensar en lo tuyo y tu sociedad y tu espacio es único. La política comparada se dedica a trascender lo local, a trascender lo propio, así que es algo un poco especial. Segundo, el federalismo comparado es un campo que no tenemos tiempo de explicarlo, pero es un campo importante que realmente poco se conoce aquí en Puerto Rico, sinceramente. Y tercero, el derecho constitucional, pero comparado, que también requiere mucho estudio y es algo que podemos integrar y de tener más tiempo lo podemos explicar, pero no hay más tiempo. Entonces, ¿cuál es el nuevo paradigma? Bueno, este paradigma, y la razón que realmente estamos aquí, de nuevo, no vamos a descartar los anteriores, proponemos algo nuevo que nos ayuda y complementa quizás a los anteriores. y es ver Puerto Rico. Aquí hay varios nombres en la pantalla, en inglés todo, ¿no? Lo puedes llamar, lo voy a decir en inglés. Puerto Rico lo puedes considerar una especie de Substate National Society.
¿Y cómo se define eso, Jaime? ¿Qué quiere decir un Substate National Society?
Bueno, eso es un poco difícil, Sergio, pero eso, ¿cómo decirlo? Déjame decir, pero además de eso hay seis en total. Lo pueden leer, no tengo que repetirlo. Pero básicamente es lo mismo. O sea, como todo en la vida, ¿no? Puedes hablar del mismo fenómeno de 6 formas distintas, pero son lo mismo. Y diferentes autores, ¿ves? LeCour, que está aquí, le llama International National Community. Tierney, que iba a venir, no vino, no pudo venir. Substate Demos y Yuch dice Substate National Society. Bueno, ¿qué quiere decir eso? Es la idea de que hay sociedades y sistemas políticos que por razones de la historia, ya sabes que los estados el estado moderno surgió más o menos como para el siglo XVIII. O sea, el estado moderno es bastante reciente. Coincidentalmente también surgió lo que hoy llamamos el nacionalismo. Ambos fenómenos. El Estado es moderno, o sea, siglo XVI, XVII y XVIII surgió el Estado. Y el nacionalismo como tal surgió, la idea de nación surgió en el siglo, a finales del siglo XVIII, ¿okay? Que es algo bastante moderno. Y quiere decir que, por lo tanto, en el mundo tenemos naciones y estados. Por procesos políticos, a veces se forman estados que tienen más de una nación adentro. Por procesos políticos, a veces se forman estados que tienen una nación adentro. Más de una nación adentro. Y esas naciones pueden ser pequeñas, tipo Corsica, dentro de lo que es Francia, tipo no tan pequeña, Quebec, dentro de lo que es Canadá. Y esos fenómenos los hay a través del mundo. Y creo que lo que estamos diciendo es que Puerto Rico es en muchos sentidos parecido a este tipo de sociedad. Y por eso le podemos llamar a Puerto Rico, como a esta isla, a la isla de Puerto Rico, cualquiera de estos nombres. A mí me gusta mucho el último que dice en inglés Substate Demos. Demos quiere decir pueblo. ¿Por qué es subestatal? Porque está por debajo a nivel del Estado. O sea, por ejemplo, Canadá es un Estado, ¿okay? Pero dentro de lo que es el Estado canadiense hay un consenso en Canadá que Quebec es una nación. Y Quebec es una nación subestatal dentro del Estado canadiense. Por eso el término subestatal. Así que de todos, si quieres más que me gusta a mí es el Substate Demos.
Y Jaime, ¿y dónde queda entonces el paradigma tradicional? Básicamente después de la Primera Guerra Mundial, ¿verdad? Se creó todo un sistema para un proceso de autodeterminación internacional para que cada nación tuviera su propio Estado, o por lo menos esa era la intención, ¿verdad? En la práctica nunca se llegó a cumplir. No,
el mundo está lleno, hay muchas más naciones que Estados, la figura la podemos buscar, pero hay muchas más naciones. Déjame decir rápidamente esto, sí. Porque va a la pregunta anterior. Aquí ves 3 razones concretas, científicas casi, por qué creo que este tipo de sociedad. Hay data científica, alguna, limitada, yo creo que se puede mejorar mucho, que indica que hay un grado de conciencia nacional. Vamos a decir, las identidades cambian, ¿okay? Las identidades evolucionan, las identidades son construidas, pero hay un grado débil de conciencia nacional aquí, ¿okay? El sistema de partidos políticos aquí es muy peculiar, ¿okay? El sistema de partidos aquí es un sistema de partidos donde los sistemas de partidos tienen muchos ejes o axis, ¿no? Un eje puede ser economía política, otro puede ser la relación entre Estado y sociedad. Y eso existe aquí en los partidos principales, pero hay otro eje que es el eje sobre cuál va a ser nuestra relación con el Estado central. ¿Okay? Ese eje predomina dentro del sistema de partidos políticos puertorriqueños, que es una situación muy parecida al de otras naciones sin Estado. Y además, lo que aquí se lleva hablando hace más de 100 años,
sí,
desde que yo nací, ¿no? Autonomismo, independencia y vamos a llamarlo federalismo. Porque si tú eres estadista, tú propones unirse al sistema federal de Estados Unidos, por lo tanto tú eres federalista, para usar los términos que usan en la academia. Y por lo tanto, nuestro sistema de partidos es muy comparable a de lugares como Quebec, Euskadi, Córcega, Cataluña, etcétera. Más rápido porque... Además de eso, yo diría que, además de eso, ¿qué tipo de nación sí está es Puerto Rico? Es una nación que tiene más o menos, está dentro, bueno, con relación con Estados Unidos, una nación más desarrollada, una nación con un sistema democrático imperfecto, pero lo tiene. Y este es el tipo de nación sin Estado que estamos hablando. Por lo tanto, bajo esas condiciones, nosotros estamos en un universo de casos que es mucho más amplio que esto. Pero esto es un término que se usa en ciencia política. Nuestro universo de casos son algunos de estos casos. Hay muchos más, pero ahora, como digo, nosotros somos muy distintos a Ruanda, por ejemplo. Somos muy distintos a la situación de los kurdos en Irak. ¿Okay? Así que eso vamos a dejarlo a un lado. Son más parecidos, pensamos,
sí.
Son más parecidos a estos casos. Por eso es que precisamente tenemos expertos. Ahora, otra pregunta.
Esta
rapidita.
pregunta
Sencillita.
En Estados Unidos es un poco controversial esta pregunta y quisiera saber tu opinión.
La pregunta esto nada más tomaría 3 horas. Pero que la pregunta es, por lo tanto, si Estados Unidos es o podría ser una democracia multinacional. Canadá es una democracia multinacional. Bélgica es una democracia multinacional. Bueno, hay diferentes contestaciones. Si algún día Puerto Rico se convierte en un Estado, no hay duda alguna, ¿verdad? Que sería que Estados Unidos se convertiría en una democracia multinacional. Ahora, ¿qué es Estados Unidos? Es una federación, es un Estado, algunos dirán un imperio, y es una nación. Bajo el status quo actual, obviamente, y los casos insulares, eso es lo que quieren decir. Que Puerto Rico no es parte de la federación, así que por lo tanto no es una federación multinacional. La idea de nación que tiene Estados Unidos, Puerto Rico no cabe, ¿bien? Así que desde el punto de vista de la entidad nacional estadounidense, para ellos no son una nación multinacional. Ahora, hay otra cosa que se llama también el Estado. Canadá es un Estado, Francia es un Estado, con mayúsculas. Y si tú lo miras desde ese punto de vista, pues sí, Estados Unidos hoy en día, aún con el estatus territorial, para mí, es multinacional, el Estado es multinacional. Pero estas son distinciones de académicos.
Bueno, no, y yo creo que es muy válida tal vez hacer una distinción aquí de facto y de jure. Tal vez de jure Estados Unidos, ¿verdad? En términos estrictamente constitucionales no se considere como una nación un Estado multinacional, pero de facto tal vez lo sea. Aunque...
Lo que acabas de decir, yo creo,
sí.
Depende de cómo lo ves, ¿no? Pero sí. Hay diferentes maneras de... Estados Unidos tiene muchas cosas a la misma vez. Ya, vamos a rápidamente en un minuto lo siguiente. Las ventajas de este nuevo paradigma, bien rápido. Primero, con este nuevo paradigma podemos comparar el autonomismo de Puerto Rico con otros autonomismos. Segundo, con este nuevo paradigma podemos mejor entender la naturaleza de la Federación de Estados Unidos. Tercero, con este nuevo paradigma podemos mejor entender el comportamiento de lo que se llama en ciencia política y en historia también, de los movimientos nacionales de las naciones. Número 4, con este nuevo paradigma podemos mejor entender el asunto del acomodo constitucional de Puerto Rico dentro de lo que es, ¿verdad?, Estados Unidos. Y quinto, con este nuevo paradigma podemos integrar el conocimiento muy amplio de la teoría política normativa para mejor entender lo que es Puerto Rico. Número 6, y ya terminando, con este nuevo paradigma hay métodos cuantitativos que se usan de muchas maneras para incluso medir cuánto autogobierno tiene Puerto Rico. Y esto se hace a través del mundo y podemos integrar a Puerto Rico en este tipo de estudios. 7, además de eso, podemos usar este paradigma para hacer análisis cualitativo. Small n quiere decir pocos casos.
Con una muestra pequeña.
2, 3, 4 casos. Usando el famoso método comparativo. André Lecourt tiene un libro reciente sobre eso. Hay yo mismo un par de artículos que ya integran a Puerto Rico en este paradigma. Y casi acabando, con este nuevo paradigma, y esto es importante, porque Jordi Argelaguet por 10 años fue director del Centro de Estudios de Opinión de Cataluña, podemos usar métodos de investigación de Public Opinion Research que aquí no se hacen. Otro proyecto para mí en los próximos 20 años. para mejor entender 20 años, para mejor entender la naturaleza de Puerto Rico. Eso no se hace, no se ha hecho, es hora de que se haga.
Y con eso, pues, vamos a comenzar entonces a explorar este paradigma con el próximo panel que estará compuesto por 3 profesores y el moderador será el señor Deepak Lambanieves.
Gracias a Sergio y a Jaime. Vamos a empezar a granular estos conceptos. Estamos en la estratosfera, vamos a empezar a ver qué quiere decir todo esto que hemos hablado. Vamos a empezar con los 2 paneles. En el primero, los 2 van a tener el mismo formato. Cada panelista hará su exposición y esta será seguida por unas reflexiones o preguntas del profesor Yuch, quien va a fungir como comentarista de cada panel. Una vez terminadas las exposiciones, se abrirá entonces un diálogo entre los panelistas y vamos a finalizar cada panel con un espacio para que los ponentes puedan abordar las preguntas de ustedes, del público. Para eso deben tener en los asientos unas tarjetitas para que puedan anotar sus preguntas. Si no tienen las tarjetas, por favor, levanten la mano para que algún ujier les haga llegar una. Una vez anotadas las preguntas, entréguenle la tarjeta al ujier para que entonces el ujier se las haga llegar al moderador. El primer panel: identidades políticas, constitucionalismo y evolución política en democracias multinacionales. Este va a ser moderado por Deepak Lambanieves, como dijo Sergio, quien es director de investigación del Centro para una Nueva Economía. Adelante.
Muy buenos días a todos y todas. If the panelists could make their way to the stage, please, to this first panel. I'm referring to Nicola, Jordi, as well as André. Please, join us up here. Vuelvo al español. Como dijo Jennifer y como dijo Sergio, tengo el placer de moderar este primer panel de la mañana que se titula Identidades políticas, constitucionalismo y evolución política en democracias multinacionales. Antes de presentar a los panelistas formalmente y arrancar con las ponencias, quiero explicarle cómo se llevará a cabo el panel. So I'm going to switch to English just to explain the mechanics of the panel real quick. Each panelist will have 15 minutes to present their positions. I'll be keeping time, but there's a staff member in the front row that will be keeping a series of cards with the time that you have remaining in your presentation. She will probably give you a 5-minute, 3-minute, and time's up mark when your time is up. So I please ask that you keep yourself to the time provided. So immediately after each panelist presents our discussant, Professor Jaime Yuch, will have 2 minutes to raise key comments and questions just to get the conversation going. Now, please don't answer these immediately. I will provide time for you guys to answer the comments or the provocations that Professor Jaime Yuch has laid out. And so we ask that you just have time to mull them over, and then we'll switch to an initial discussion. After this first round of discussion, then we'll open up to Q&A from the public. Ahora vuelvo al español, como les explicó Jennifer. El turno de preguntas y respuestas lo vamos a hacer de una manera distinta. Ellos van a repartir, los miembros del staff van a repartir unas tarjetas. Por favor, escriban sus preguntas o comentarios de forma clara y concisa. Yo voy a recibir esas tarjetas y voy a entonces a presentarles sus preguntas y comentarios a los colegas. Voy a tomar 3 preguntas inicialmente. Si tenemos más tiempo, hacemos otra ronda y así por el estilo. Así que, sin más que añadir, without further ado, let me introduce our first panelist. Our first panelist is Professor Nicola McEwen. I'm going to switch now to, if you can go to the podium, please. I'm going to switch to Spanish to introduce you. Nicola McEwen es profesora de Política Territorial en la Universidad de Edimburgo. También es miembro de la Royal Society de Edimburgo y fue codirectora, fundadora del Center on Constitutional Change con sede en la misma Universidad de Edimburgo. Nicola enfoca su trabajo en la política territorial comparada, la descentralización y la gobernanza multinivel. También el nacionalismo y dinámicas políticas de la identidad nacional y la política escocesa. Su investigación examina el proceso de devolución o descentralización y el gobierno multinivel en el Reino Unido y cómo el Brexit ha afectado las relaciones entre las 4 naciones, territorios que componen el Reino Unido. Nicola, thank you.
Primero, buenos días a todos. Muchas gracias, Jaime y Jennifer, a todos en el CNE por la invitación. Es mi primera vez en Puerto Rico y estoy muy contenta y muy honrada de estar aquí. Now in English. No? Okay, so first of all, I wanted to describe to you the United Kingdom as a multinational state. So connecting to the presentation of Jaime, because this is a very normal understanding and an uncontested understanding of the United Kingdom. And part of that is related to how the United Kingdom evolved. I like to remind people that the United Kingdom, as it is presently constituted, is only 100 years old. The centenary of the partition of Ireland was this year. So it's quite a new state. But because of the way it was constituted as a union state or a state of unions, an idea not unfamiliar to those in the US, that meant that even when there was political centralization, it was possible for the constituent territories to remain identified as nations and to retain a distinctive institutional framework and a distinctive territorial identity and recognition as nations within a multinational state. So when devolution was introduced to that state, it was built upon differences that were already there. Even before devolution, which was in 1999, the political parties, even the ones that were British-wide political parties, had to take into account that multinational dimension. They had to recognize that there was a need to speak to, in particular, Scotland as a nation within the United Kingdom. And here is an illustration of that. So we have now in the UK a system of devolution that dates to 1999, so quite young. But when there was a long campaign to establish the Parliament in Scotland and then also the Parliament in Wales, Northern Ireland was a little bit different because it was bound up with conflict and peace and conflict resolution. But within Scotland, it was very much about having democratic institutions for a nation within the United Kingdom. And the document here on the I don't know where you're seeing it, but yeah, here, sorry, on the left-hand side of the screen, this was used by those, not just nationalists, but those who wanted a parliament to talk about this being Scotland's right as a nation, to have a voice, to have its own parliament, to make its own decisions. So that claim of right was very important to the democratic legitimacy of the new institutions when they were established. And that idea of national self-determination also underpinned the referendum on independence that was held in 2014, when the people of Scotland were asked to decide, should Scotland be an independent country? And unusually, at that time, the United Kingdom government recognised that it was their right to decide and facilitated the process after the pro-independence party won a majority in the Scottish Parliament. Now, at that time, the decision that was made was to stay within the United Kingdom by a comfortable majority so that no one doubted the result, but also it was close enough to ensure that the issue never really went away. Fast forward to less than 2 years after that, and there was another important referendum in the United Kingdom, this time on the decision of whether or not to remain in or to leave the European Union. Now, the interesting thing about this referendum was that it was based on the assumptions of the United Kingdom as a nation. It was a single question with a single electorate and a majority across the United Kingdom, which did not and could not reflect the territorial complexity, the multinational character of the United Kingdom. So you had a supposedly national vote taking place within a plurinational or a multinational state. And you see the patterns and the complexities here of the way the result turned out, where the map slightly exaggerates things because it was about counting areas, but it nonetheless gives you a visual representation of the different attitudes in the different nations of the United Kingdom towards the relationship with the European Union. So then you had the situation where within Scotland in particular, there was a feeling emerged that Scotland's voice as a nation was not being heard in the context of Brexit. This was not what we wanted. This is against our will. These are phrases that were recurring phrases from the Scottish government, then and now led by the pro-independent Scottish National Party. So the second challenge is that the whole Brexit process has amplified the problems of not being able to reflect the territorial complexity that is the United Kingdom. So it's the Brexit decision itself that has created a problem, but also the process of negotiating Brexit, negotiating the United Kingdom's exit and future relationship with the European Union, and also, as I'll come on to, the process of preparing domestically for Brexit. But here you see a letter that was jointly written by the First Minister of Scotland and the First Minister of Wales, complaining that their voices, their nations, their interests were not being taken into account in the Brexit process in terms of the negotiations with the European Union. And they were right. They were not being taken into account. They were completely ignored and sidelined in that process. The other challenge is about domestic preparation for Brexit. So devolution, when it was introduced within the European Union. And the European Union provided a scaffolding for the system of multi-level government that was constructed within the United Kingdom. Because European Union law and European Union regulation was an umbrella for everybody, then it meant that there were fewer divergences within, not just between member states, but within member states as well. And the fear was, what happens when you remove that scaffolding? What happens then? And certainly the fear on the part of the UK government was that you create new barriers, new divergences that might weaken and threaten the United Kingdom as a union state. And so lots of things they did were cooperative. They worked together to develop common frameworks that might replace European Union frameworks. And that was very much a co-owned and a cooperative process that had small governments, small devolved governments, quite peripheral in a sense, around the table with the UK government as equals in this space, because they were talking about areas of policy that were devolved. Unfortunately, that was also contrasted with a much more centralized and centrally driven top-down process that led most obviously, there are a few other examples, but most obviously to a piece of legislation called the United Kingdom Internal Market Act, which has proven to be extremely controversial. This piece of legislation gave the UK government new spending powers, it gave them new constitutional powers and policy powers, and it assured that Brexit would not lead to new regulatory barriers, or rather, it meant that new regulatory barriers that may emerge after Brexit would not be significant and would not be important barriers for business, and business could essentially ignore them. The consequence of that is to undermine the policy competence and authority that the devolved institutions would have. The other challenge is around the significance of devolution within the United Kingdom. The UK is not a federation, and so devolution didn't do anything to change the ability of the Westminster Parliament to make any laws it wants to for any part of the United Kingdom. But there was a convention, and conventions are quite important in the UK Constitution. There was a convention that the UK Parliament essentially voluntarily limited its own powers in areas that had been devolved. This convention was known as the Sewell Convention. It was a voluntary constraint on the sovereignty of the UK Parliament in respect of devolution, in respect of the national character of the devolved territories. And essentially they didn't make laws in areas that were devolved without the consent of the devolved institutions. The problem is that hasn't really worked in the context of Brexit, and it only worked so long as nobody really tested it. And now it's been tested on a number of occasions around Brexit, including with the very controversial United Kingdom Internal Market Act that I just illustrated, and it's been found wanting. So now the symbolic significance of that voluntary constraint is open to question, and it has in some senses undermined the authority of the devolved institutions. So what is the alternative then? If you are a nation within a state and you're no longer comfortable within that state, if you feel that the state can't or won't accommodate your status as a nation in the way that it did before, for Scotland, is independence still an alternative? Well, that's certainly the position of the pro-independence Scottish National Party government, and they are intent on holding another independence referendum. Now, it's quite soon after the one before, but the rationale is because Brexit changed everything. Brexit was a vote and an event and a process that took place against the national will, and it changed the circumstances in which Scotland decided to stay within the United Kingdom. So the Scottish government wants to hold an independence referendum next year, but can it? And this is the question that we face currently. There is no longer the accommodative process. There is no longer a UK government willing to accommodate an independence process, willing to cooperate and facilitate an independence referendum as happened in 2014. And so there is some doubt about the legality of Scottish Parliament law to hold an independence referendum. To anticipate a legal challenge further down the line, the Scottish Government made its own reference to the UK Supreme Court to test the legality of Scottish Parliament independence referendum laws. And that's where we are now. We don't know yet the outcome of that case. I'm sure we will talk about that in the discussion. One of the other challenges, though, is that support for independence is stuck. It's stuck at about 50% of the people of Scotland. And one might ask if, given, I'm sure it hasn't escaped your attention, the political turmoil that we've seen of recent weeks and months in the United Kingdom, if that hasn't shifted the dial, if that hasn't shifted people towards independence, it's maybe difficult to imagine what will. Maybe if Boris Johnson is successful in his bid to return to be Prime Minister, we will see. But that's where I'll leave it, and we'll pick up some of these issues in discussion. Thank you. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Jaime.
Yes, thank you very much, Nicola. So my role is to, in less than 2 minutes, pose 2 comments. The idea of the comments is to, in many ways, start making us think comparatively, similarities, differences, interesting angles between cases such as Scotland, the UK, and Puerto Rico. Some of you might call this a provocative appetizer, and it is for you to mull over it until in like half an hour when we actually discuss your opinions. The first comment is, as you mentioned, we all know that in 2012 there was the Edinburgh Agreement between Salmon and Cameron, which was a legally binding, mutually agreed framework for holding a self-determination referendum in Scotland in 2014, which is an extraordinary constitutional achievement in a way. Here in Puerto Rico, despite numerous criollo plebiscites, I've lost track how many, since 1952, the U.S. Congress has never agreed to a legally binding referendum. In fact, an effort to do something like that this year is about to fail or has failed. So to let us learn, my first question is, what were the political and constitutional circumstances that made possible that agreement in 2012? And 2, now, as you just said, the conservative government, or whatever that government is now, has refused to grant another referendum. Johnson did not want it. So, what's going to happen? Will the Catalan route of 2017 be followed by Scotland, and what will Nicola Sturgeon do in 2023 if no agreement is reached? Okay, that's one. Second comment. Since the evolution, what you just said, the Sewell Convention provided the UK Parliament may not legislate for devolved matters without the consent of the devolved legislature affected. And this was actually codified, as I understand it, in 2016 in Section 28.8 of the Scotland Act. Okay. In Puerto Rico, the U.S. Congress has been much less respectful of the autonomy of the Estado Libre Asociado, to put it mildly. So we will be interested in knowing more. How does Section 28A of the Scotland Act work in practice? I know you mentioned it in a slide. And does it indeed, in your opinion, offer a strong guarantee of autonomy for the Scottish Parliament? And lastly, I would add what we call a ñapa here in Puerto Rico. And it is that I think the audience would be very interested in, you are the director of the Center on Constitutional Change in Edinburgh. I have been there. I was there 3 years ago. I respect it very much. I think it was founded by Michael Keating, somebody I know very well. And so I think here in Puerto Rico, they'll be very interested in hearing from you later on about what it is. What do you do in the Center for Constitutional Change? Because it's another one of these things that I could do in the next 20 years.
Thank you, Jaime. We'll have now our second panelist, André Lecour. So please take the podium. I'll do your introduction in Spanish. André Lecour es profesor en el School of Political Studies de la Universidad de Ottawa, presidente también de la Asociación de Ciencias Políticas Canadiense, y en diciembre se convierte en Fellow del Royal Society de Canadá. André enfoca su trabajo en la política canadiense, el nacionalismo, con especial atención a Quebec, Escocia, Flandes, Cataluña y el País Vasco, y también el federalismo. Es autor de varios libros sobre teoría institucional, nacionalismo, secesionismo y autonomía, política federal, fiscal y política social territorial. André.
Muchas gracias. So, my story will be a little bit different from Nicola's, because the Scottish story is one where support for independence has, increased over the last decade. And in my country, it's a little bit different. So Canada is multinational, just like the United Kingdom, insofar as most people of my home province in Quebec first of all, of French speakers, and will identify with Quebec as their nation or their primary nation. Not everybody, but an overwhelming majority, which means that, most Quebecers see the country as being multinational. In addition, of course, Canada's indigenous peoples who also consider themselves to be nations quite different from the Canadian nation. So Canada, a pretty substantive multinational state. Now, Quebec governments have for a long time sought to be recognized as a nation within the Canadian Constitution. Unlike the United Kingdom, a little bit closer to Spain, that has proven difficult. Most Canadians are reluctant to see their country as multinational, as containing multiple nations. For them, the only nation is the Canadian nation. So this conflict has really been at the center of Canadian politics for decades. For a few decades, beginning in the 1960s, politicians in Canada attempted to find a constitutional solution to these claims from the Quebec government. In other words, the Quebec and the larger Canadian federal political classes attempted to find a wording for the Canadian Constitution that would express this multinational character. And there were many different rounds of negotiations to essentially satisfy demands of Quebec governments who sought to see the province's nationhood constitutionally recognized in Canada. Again, as I said, it's difficult because Canadians don't see their country the same way. And these negotiations, which would have included a very kind of short sentence in the Canadian Constitution stating that Quebec is a distinct society. We didn't go all the way towards nation. That was too controversial. So the politicians felt maybe distinct society would be a good compromise. So there was proposals that did be inserted into the Canadian Constitution. These proposals were adopted by all provinces, but eventually they failed. They never materialized. They were never implemented because public opinion outside Quebec was too strongly against this language, and politicians outside of Quebec took notice and, backtracked, essentially. So this process of constitutional negotiations coincided with a massive increase in support for Quebec independence. So I think there is a bit of a lesson here for multinational states. Typically, minority nations, or as I call them in my book, internal national communities, they want to be recognized as such by the state, within the state. When they look for that type of recognition and it doesn't come, or worse, when it seems to be coming but eventually doesn't end up materialized, this is a potentially explosive situation. And in this context, a lot of Quebecers felt that not being recognized as seemingly promised by the rest of the country as a distinct nation within the country was a rejection of who they were, essentially. Was a sign that Canada was closed, right, to Quebecers and their identity. Was a sign that the country could not be reformed, that the country was static, was a dead end. And that led the country to, somewhere very close to the brink in 1995. So it's a little bit further removed than the Scottish referendum. But in 1995, there was a referendum on independence in Quebec. Now, not with the question as clear as the Scottish question, but the meaning, I think, for most Quebecers was clear, that voting yes in 1995 would trigger some form of negotiations of secession. The Canadian government back then, although it did not sign an agreement with the Quebec governments on a referendum and what to do in the event of a positive outcome, a yes vote in favor of independence, implicitly, for the second time, of course, because there was a previous referendum on independence 15 years earlier, in 1980, but the Canadian government implicitly accepted the legitimacy of the referendum by campaigning against independence. Okay? So you have in Quebec in 1980 and then in 1995, instances of something that is very rare, right? A self-determination referendum featuring an independence option in a country that's advanced, industrialized, liberal, democratic, free of security concerns. And I think, we've heard kind of the figure 50% in Scotland. Maybe we'll hear something similar in Catalonia. It's very difficult, of course, to get citizens of a state, liberal, democratic, advanced, industrialized, to support independence with the potential uncertainty that this involves. But in Quebec in 1995, it came very, very close. The result was 49.4% in favor of independence, so just a little bit short of 50%. Now, what would have happened if that 50% had been reached is completely unclear. Thereafter, political actors in the yes camp have even said that their worst nightmare was to get 50 or 51 because they weren't sure that it was going to be enough to transition towards independence. But the point here is that, politics in Quebec in the 70s, in the 80s, in the 90s, up to the 2000s, was completely focused on this question, right? To put it in Scottish terms, should Quebec be an independent country? That seemed to be the plight of Quebec politics forever, and until independence would be reached. And certainly in 1995, the narrative seemed to be that, certainly secessionist leaders, people who wanted independence, were saying, we were kind of at zero in the 1960s, now it's 1995, we're at 49.4. So surely independence will come soon. There was this sense that this was kind of a unidirectional path. And everybody was expecting a third, final referendum that would finally, for supporters, lead to Quebec independence. And there were good reasons to think that, because young people in Quebec back then were very strongly in favor of independence, right? So there were these ideas that, as the population aged, older voters were those who hung on to Canada, and as they aged, and younger people who were more supportive of independence came into the citizenry, then the numbers would be there for Quebec's independence. Now, Quebec independence has not happened, so this is a certain surprise. Not a huge surprise, again, because it's very difficult to get citizens of liberal democracies to support independence. What's more surprising is that support for independence in Quebec has significantly decreased. It's probably around 30% right now, which is high for most places, but not in Quebec. But more tellingly, the issue of independence is not widely debated anymore. The party system that used to be completely polarized, Quebec had one party in favor of independence and one party against, and everything went through that, is now becoming much more multidimensional and much more complex. And so the question is, why has that happened? And it's an interesting question, I think, for comparative politics, an interesting question for communities like Scotland, like Catalonia, like Puerto Rico. I think one of the things that it says, first of all, is things change, and sometimes not in a predictable fashion. Now, from a descriptive point of view, we know what happened. We know that young people now, contrary to expectations, are not supportive of independence. They're not more attached to Canada than before. They just think about politics in a different way. They think about the plight of women, of people, of racialized minorities, of LGBTQ members. They have a different view of what is important to them in politics. And interestingly, those who still support independence for Quebec are those who experience all these constitutional negotiations that created great tensions. Right? So there's one generation there that is still supportive of Quebec independence. So what's been done? So profoundly, why has independence for Quebec, why has its support fallen? Well, my argument is pretty simple, actually, is that when the tool for managing Quebec was the Constitution, when the political class tried to accommodate Quebec by constitutional negotiations, it created tensions because there was no agreement on the place of Quebec in the Canadian Federation. In 1995, the Canadian political class has chosen, since 1995, it's chosen to forego constitutional negotiations. It's decided we're going to use different instruments. We're not going to try to amend the Canadian Constitution anymore. And in doing that, it essentially has used the mechanisms of Canadian federalism, right? We have 11 governments, a federal government, 10 provinces. There's a dense network of intergovernmental relations in Canada. So, you know, if the Quebec government wants more powers on immigration, because the French-speaking society wants to control a little bit more, like who comes in, then it engages in negotiations with the federal government bilaterally without having to resort to the Constitution. These negotiations are much lower profile than constitutional negotiations. They tend to be maybe not less contentious, but people don't see it as much. So there's been, in a sense, less conflict, and I think for Quebecers, there's a sense that Canada is not as close to them as it once seemed, and that things can change and things can move in Canada, but only if we don't do it through the Constitution. So I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very good. 2 minutes. Thank you, Andre. I wanted to mention very briefly that one of the outstanding issues for me of being here is that I've known many of them, a lot of them, for quite a few years. I first met Andre in Montreal in 2003 at a seminar there. And Nicola, by the way, I think in 2016 at Ottawa Gatineau conference. So it's great to see them here again. Now, for Andre, your provocative appetizers are two. First, as you know, in Puerto Rico, an important political orientation is pro-federalism. That is becoming a unit of the U.S. Federation. There are, we know, similarities and differences, important ones, between Canadian and U.S. federalism. And the debate on Quebec and Canadian federalism, we know, is sophisticated and quite influenced by comparative federalism. So my question is, what are the constitutional contours of Canadian federalism that you most treasure? Because in your view, they allow the accommodation of Quebec as a distinct society in the federation. Okay. Second, in Puerto Rico, for over 100 years here, we have had, political parties advocating autonomism. In fact, since 1952, we have a form of autonomism called the Estado Libre Asociado. Now, in Quebec, the CAQ government, the caquist government of François Legault, is officially autonomous also. We also don't know that in the middle of the 20th century, the old Union Nationale of Maurice Duplessis was autonomist, and the old ADQ of Jean Allaire was autonomist. I interviewed Jean Allaire myself some years ago. But today, what does it mean to be autonomist in the CAQ's view, in the context of the Canadian Federation? And finally, the ñapa for you would be that I would hear people would be interested in hearing in institutionally how people study these issues in Ottawa and in Quebec. For example, the GRSP group, and what do you do, or what they've done, and because learning about the institutions that you have, fortunately for you, in Scotland and Quebec, we have none here. So, and again, it's part of my 20-year project, so we would like to hear about that. Thanks.
Thank you, Jaime. Jordi, please take the podium. Our third presenter, nuestro tercer panelista, Jordi Argelaguet, es profesor titular en el Departamento de Ciencias Políticas y Derecho Público de una Universitat Autónoma de Barcelona. Investiga principalmente el nacionalismo, los partidos políticos no estatales, la política catalana y la política lingüística. Ha escrito sobre el proceso independentista catalán, la identidad catalana y la dinámica de los partidos políticos en Cataluña. Entre 2011 y 2021 fue el director del prestigioso Centro de Estudios de Opinión de la Generalitat de Cataluña. Gracias, Jordi.
Muchas gracias. En principio, para empezar, querría dar las gracias al CNE por habernos invitado a asistir en este seminario tan importante, a participar y compartir opiniones con unos distinguidos colegas y delante de una audiencia que entiendo que está haciendo un ejercicio de civismo muy importante. Yo, para empezar, muy rápidamente, me voy a ahorrar el pasado histórico del conflicto entre Cataluña y el actual Reino de España. Es un conflicto muy antiguo, cuyas raíces el análisis de las raíces nos llevaría muy lejos. Por el momento estamos en un empate permanente. España no ha conseguido convertirse en un típico Estado-nación como el ejemplo francés, por ejemplo, un solo Estado coincidiendo con una sola nación, respetando lógicamente los restos que quedan de Córcega, los bretones, los vascos, los catalanes que hay al otro lado de la frontera. Y Cataluña tampoco ha conseguido, en su intento de devenir un Estado independiente, a diferencia de otros movimientos nacionales que surgen más o menos en el mismo tiempo y que sí lo han conseguido, por hablar de los países bálticos o algunos países de Europa Central o Oriental. Yo me voy a centrar a partir de datos de encuesta. Voy a utilizar unos datos de las encuestas promovidas por el Centro de Investigaciones Sociológicas, que es un organismo de mucho prestigio que depende del gobierno español. Y además voy a utilizar también datos hechos, producidos por el Centro de Estudios de Opinión del Gobierno de Cataluña. Concretamente una encuesta que hicimos en el año 2019, que es una encuesta que ya ha quedado como la única que se hizo sobre temas nacionales de valoración del Estado autonómico en un contexto, agitado de la política española de los últimos años. Sigue esta encuesta del CEO el esquema que tradicionalmente había seguido el CIS, haciendo una encuesta periódica, un barómetro autonómico, que por circunstancias diversas, el último que hicieron fue en el 2012. Por lo tanto, son los únicos datos disponibles y que, como las encuestas o se hacen o ya no se pueden volver a hacer porque ya ha pasado el tiempo, pues es lo que tenemos disponible. Estos datos nos permiten valorar el estado de opinión, de la opinión española en general, también de la opinión pública en Cataluña, sobre el proceso independentista catalán, cómo ha impactado en la opinión pública española, y nos permite ver las coordenadas que eventualmente podrían enmarcar una eventual solución, acomodo, cualquiera que sea, a partir, en primer lugar, de la opinión que tienen los ciudadanos, teniendo en cuenta que luego los partidos políticos gestionan estos datos según sus legítimos intereses o preferencias. Hay un gran contraste entre la opinión expresada en Cataluña respecto a la opinión del resto de España. Yo lo plantearé contrastando los datos para el conjunto de España, pero como hay estas diferencias importantes, los datos del conjunto de España vienen matizados por lo que dicen los catalanes, y por tanto es interesante contrastar qué piensan Cataluña, qué piensan el resto de los ciudadanos del Estado español. Por tanto, voy a empezar con una presentación de una evolución de las preferencias territoriales de organización territorial del Estado español. Luego me voy a centrar un pequeño análisis, modestamente, sobre las bases político-sociales de las distintas alternativas que se están planteadas, y luego algunas opiniones sobre la reforma constitucional, una posible reforma constitucional española, para ver qué sería posible, al menos a partir de los datos que nos dicen que piensan los ciudadanos. Empiezo muy rápidamente. Una primera pregunta para centrar el panorama es la pregunta relativa, como punto de partida, los diferentes significados de España. Preguntamos en esta encuesta, que la hicimos en el conjunto de España, ¿qué significa España para usted? Se ve los tres subgrupos que he identificado. En una primera columna hay el conjunto de las personas encuestadas en el conjunto de España, la segunda es el resto de España y la tercera columna es el caso de Cataluña. Básicamente el contraste es evidente, lo he marcado también para que sea fácilmente comprensible. La inmensa mayoría, casi 2/3 de los ciudadanos españoles, consideran España o bien su país o bien su nación. Eso contrasta con el caso de Cataluña, que consideran España su país el 24% y un 10% su nación. En cambio, un 23%, 24% es igual, y un otro 22% consideran o bien que España es un Estado compuesto por nacionalidades y regiones, que de hecho es el término que se utiliza constitucionalmente, o bien una visión más dura en estos términos: España es un Estado extranjero del cual mi país no debería formar parte. Ese es el panorama. En Cataluña la opinión pública está más dividida y en el caso del resto de España, pues, como ven ustedes, una clara mayoría nación o país. Esto ya nos marca el elemento básico de donde se están discutiendo, se están debatiendo las cosas, la percepción ya de qué es España. Nos liberaría un largo trabajo resumir el debate que es España, que ha preocupado a mucha gente durante muchos años. Un primer elemento a destacar es el bajo reconocimiento de la plurinacionalidad nacional en España. A diferencia de otros casos, a pesar que la Constitución española habla de nacionalidades y regiones, también habla de la nación española, esto a nivel estrictamente popular, ciudadano, pues tiene el reconocimiento que más o menos esta encuesta nos indica. Un segundo elemento para ir avanzando es una pregunta que ya también denota la enorme diferencia que hay entre Cataluña y el resto de España, según estos datos que tenemos. Les preguntábamos a la gente que ubicara en una escala de 0 a 10 el grado de descentralización o centralización que hay en España, la percibida y la deseada. Y aquí el contraste es también evidente. En el conjunto de España se percibe que España está medianamente descentralizada, 5,4, siendo 10 máxima descentralización, y en cambio deseada queda justo por debajo del 5. Pero cuando contrastamos el resto de España con Cataluña, se invierte la situación. Los catalanes perciben España, el Estado español, muy centralizado y desean mucha más descentralización. Y en cambio, en el resto del Estado, en el conjunto de los ciudadanos del resto de España, perciben que está más descentralizada y en cambio la querrían mucho menos. Con lo cual, casi que el mínimo aceptable para unos es el máximo tolerable para otros, y es este gap, esta distancia la que se tiene que llenar. El resultado es que España es un Estado compuesto, casi federal, con altas dosis de asimetría entre las distintas comunidades autónomas. No todas tienen el mismo nivel competencial. La autonomía, pues, que tienen cada una de las comunidades autónomas es controvertido determinar cuánta autonomía tienen cada una de ellas. Es un debate de un profundo calado académico y también político. España vendría a ser una federación en cuanto al gasto político. Las comunidades autónomas participan del gasto público de una manera muy considerable, pero en cambio, si atenemos las finanzas públicas desde el punto de vista del ingreso, España es un Estado muy centralista. Es el Estado central quien recauda la mayor parte, la inmensidad de los impuestos, y deja un margen muy pequeño a las comunidades autónomas para regir qué sistema de taxación se impone a los ciudadanos. Dentro de esta asimetría, el País Vasco y Navarra comen aparte, van por su propia vía, tienen un sistema de financiación muy diferente. Por tanto, es un Estado compuesto, 17 comunidades autónomas más 2 ciudades autónomas en el norte de África, para complicarlo un poquito más, y con estas percepciones diferentes sobre el grado de descentralización deseada y percibida. Por tanto, una vía que podría haber sería profundizar en la asimetría en el trato de las distintas comunidades autónomas, atendiendo a las demandas populares que se pueden hacer, que son diferentes en las distintas partes del Estado de las autonomías. Sería una vía. Pero esto también tiene un recorrido limitado, porque hay una fuerte competencia de igualación entre las comunidades autónomas y por tanto se tendría que ver qué margen sería posible. ¿Cómo se vuelve atrás? Sí, a ver. En este gráfico tenemos a disposición la evolución de las preferencias territoriales que hay en un grupo de columnas es en el resto de España y en el otro en el caso de Cataluña. Se pregunta, es una pregunta tradicional en el CIS, son datos del CIS mayoritariamente, excepto un caso. Se pregunta qué preferencia querría usted para organizar territorialmente España. Y se ofrecen diversas soluciones que han variado en el tiempo, pero básicamente se remiten a lo mismo. No autonomía, que es la franja negra, menos autonomía que la actual, que es la lila, la violeta, la gris, que es el status quo, el verde es más autonomía, el naranja, que las comunidades autónomas pudieran devenir un Estado independiente, y finalmente no sabe, no contesta. Como vemos, los colores ya son diferentes entre Cataluña y el conjunto del Estado. En España, en el conjunto del Estado y básicamente en el resto de España, pues en estos datos, el gris es el que predomina, que es el status quo. Tenemos que tener en cuenta que el status quo es un elemento dinámico, porque se va adaptando en función de la sentencia del Tribunal Constitucional y el nivel de autonomía varía con los años. Pero básicamente hay una adhesión importante al status quo. Ha crecido en los últimos años gente que quiere menos autonomía o incluso no quiere autonomía. Y luego hay una franja verde, que es la gente que querría más autonomía, que se podría interpretar hipotéticamente como los partidarios de una España federal. Se tendría que decidir qué modelo de federación sería. Y finalmente hay una franja muy pequeña, amarilla-naranja, que son los partidarios de que las comunidades autónomas pudieran devenir independientes. Como estamos hablando del resto de España, en esta pequeña franja se concentran básicamente algunos ciudadanos del País Vasco, algunos de Valencia, algunos de las Islas Baleares y luego ciudadanos españoles, lógicamente, del conjunto del Estado, que tienen una sensibilidad que no es estrictamente que quieran dividir el Estado español, sino que les gustaría, tal como está formada la pregunta, vivir en un Estado donde las comunidades autónomas pudieran ser independientes, independientemente que ellos quisieran realmente la independencia, pero quizás una persona de una perspectiva liberal desde el punto de vista europeo, pues bueno, que decida cada pueblo lo que quiera. En el caso de Cataluña es bastante distinto y contrasta muchísimo. Y hay más cambios en la opinión pública en estos últimos años. El status quo es menor, en principio era la primera opción, pero fue superada por más autonomía, coincidió en los años que se estaba debatiendo un nuevo estatuto de autonomía y finalmente una etapa que empezaría alrededor del 2010-2011, que sería cuando la opción mayoritaria, pero es la minoría mayoritaria que quisiera una opción sobre la independencia. El punto de flexión está en el 2010-2011, que coinciden dos cosas muy importantes. Una sentencia del Tribunal Constitucional sobre el Estatuto de Autonomía de Cataluña, un Estatuto de Autonomía que fue aprobado primero como proyecto por el Parlamento de Cataluña con el 85% de los votos de los diputados, luego fue discutido en las Cortes Generales, allí fue aprobado debidamente retocado para adaptarlo según el criterio de los miembros del Parlamento español a la constitucionalidad y los pactos políticos. Luego este texto fue refrendado por el pueblo catalán de acuerdo con la Constitución y lo que está establecido en la reforma de los estatutos, con una participación en un referéndum bastante baja, porque ya había mucha gente que no lo aceptaba como había quedado, pero fue aprobado por amplia mayoría y finalmente, de acuerdo con el ordenamiento jurídico, este estatuto fue, a petición del Partido Popular y el Defensor del Pueblo y en algunas comunidades autónomas, fue llevado al Tribunal Constitucional Español para que revisara la constitucionalidad del estatuto. Un Tribunal Constitucional Español, no me voy a alargar, que tenía problemas de composición y por tanto podríamos entrar sobre el alcance de su plena legitimidad, pero es igual, decidió muy seriamente limitar la autonomía de Cataluña. El problema que nos encontramos desde el punto de vista teórico es que Cataluña se está rigiendo por un estatuto que el pueblo de Cataluña no lo ha ratificado. O sea, que no se ha vuelto a refrendar ese estatuto de autonomía y por tanto hay un cierto déficit democrático. Algunos independentistas les trae al pairo el estatuto de autonomía, pero legalmente es un estatuto que no ha estado refrendado, sino que es la voluntad del Tribunal Constitucional Español. Por lo tanto, la sentencia es muy importante y en segundo lugar es muy relevante el elemento vinculado a la victoria del Partido Popular, un partido de centro-derecha, que tiene una visión de España más centralista, a diferencia del Partido Socialista Obrero Español, que sería un poco más sensible a la diversidad cultural y lingüística del Estado español. La mayoría del Partido Popular, mayoría absoluta, fue percibida en Cataluña como una seria amenaza también a la capacidad de negociar algún tipo de acomodo. Y es el punto pues, de inflexión que tenemos planteado. Bien, me he excedido en el tiempo. Pienso que ya con las preguntas que me hagan ya podré contestar un poco más sobre estas cuestiones. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Jordi.
Muchas gracias, Jordi, otra vez. Y tengo 2 minutos. Aprovecho 30 segundos para, de nuevo, una nota personal, y me excusan por eso. Pero conozco a Jordi Argelaguet desde 2004, me parece, cuando yo estaba investigando el caso catalán. Y la primera vez que lo vi fue en su oficina en la Universidad Autónoma de Barcelona, hace ya mucho tiempo. Y desde entonces pues, nos hemos mantenido en contacto. De hecho, estuve en su casa en Sabadell para las elecciones 2015, si no me equivoco, creo. Y él fue mi anfitrión todo un día en Sabadell para ver como 6 colegios electorales distintos. Fue una gran experiencia. Dicen que conocer y hacer amistad con una persona, con un catalán o una catalana es muy difícil, que son un poco cerrados. Ese es el mito. Bueno. Pero también dice que una vez tienes la amistad que es para toda la vida, así que espero que sea para toda la vida también. Bueno, entonces, about the provocative appetizers, 2 of them. Número 1, you have a lot of experience in public opinion research. experience, yes, given your past role during almost 10 years as director of the Centre de Estudios de Opinión of the Generalitat, from the point of view of political science and other social sciences, and their concern with scientific measurement of political and social phenomena, how can the type of public opinion research conducted by entities like the CEO or the CIS in Madrid contribute to a better scientific understanding of the dilemmas of accommodation of national diversity in multinational democracies? Número 2. The state of autonomy since 1978 offers the comunidades autónomas as a form of autonomism. Nevertheless, as you just mentioned, since 2010, we have seen a lot of political discontent in Catalonia and a growth of a pro-secessionism orientation. What characteristics of the current autonomism in Catalonia and Spain are least satisfactory for those segments of the population that have moved on from pro-autonomism or pro-federalism to pro-sovereignty?
Gracias, Jaime. Antes de comenzar la discusión, before we begin our first round of discussion, I'd like to remind the members of the audience that if you have questions, please write them down in the cards. Some members of the staff will be picking them up, handing them over to me, and then we'll do that round later on. So for the next, let's say, 10, 15 minutes, let's start off the discussion amongst ourselves right here in the podium. I don't know if Nicola wants to start or Andre, so take it away, please.
Thank you. Very interesting questions, Jaime. The Edinburgh Agreement, just for background, was reached between the Scottish Government and the UK Government. It wasn't that it was legally binding, because there is no such thing in the United Kingdom because of the sovereignty of the UK Parliament. So no referendum, neither independence one in 2014 nor the Brexit one in 2016. None of these were legally binding, but they were politically binding. Why did they do that? They did it because there was legal doubt about the Scottish Parliament's authority to hold an independence referendum, and David Cameron, then Prime Minister, immediately, without consulting any of his officials, said after the SNP won a majority in the election, he immediately recognized their right to hold an independence referendum, as they had committed to do so in their manifesto. Now, there are two reasons for that, I think. One is that he was certain that it would lose, and because at the time the support for independence was around 30%, so it seemed a long way off. And the second thing was that he thought, well, is the importance of a majoritarian culture in UK politics. And he recognized they won the contest, they won the majority. So for him, it was the costs of not doing it would be greater potentially than accommodating that process. More interesting for me, though, is not so much the agreement itself, but in the months prior to the referendum, both governments worked together on a little pamphlet that was distributed to every household, and it said, if more people vote yes than vote no, Scotland will become an independent country. And it more or less said, without explicitly saying it, 50 plus 1 is all you need, and we will honour it. And the reverse was also true, and that was the more remarkable thing. That's not where we are now. There is no political will to accommodate that kind of process, and the weight of legal opinion seems to expect the Supreme Court to say that the Scottish Parliament does not have the authority to legislate for an independence referendum. And even if it did, then what it doesn't have the authority to do is see through an independence process. That cannot be done without the support and the consent and the cooperation of the UK government. So in some senses, that does leave Scotland in a position similar to Catalonia, except that the UK is not indivisible. There is no constitutional barrier to independence, and clearly it's only 100 years old, right? So it clearly is divisible. But there are few legal pathways without the consent of the UK parties and levels. My sense is that that's a relatively easy place for the UK government, of any UK government, to be in, so long as Scotland is divided on the issue. So the bigger challenge for the SNP is how you build that support beyond 50%. And they're stuck, they may be stuck there. Do you want me to answer the second question? Or? Yeah. So you asked about the Sewell Convention. It was written into legislation, but not in any way that gave it legal foundation. And this was tested in the Supreme Court in the context of Brexit legislation and the UK Parliament's desire to have a say and consent to the exit agreement, the withdrawal agreement. The devolved institutions had made a case at the time that because of the Sewell Convention and because it was written into law, they too should have the right to consent. And the Supreme Court said that it was just a convention, and the way that it was written into the law didn't make it anything other than a convention, and the convention is that they would not normally legislate on devolved matters without consent. So there's now this big debate about, well, what is normal and what does normally mean? So I would say that the Sewell Convention worked and was important up until the point that it was not, if you see what I mean. So up until the point that it was tested, then it lost its authority and it lost its status. And we're in that situation now of, there is, I think, a desire among more than just the nationalists, but a desire to sort of see if we can get back to a workable Sewell Convention that maybe is a little bit more codified than the one we have now.
So what are the aspects of the Canadian Constitution that allows for managing an internal national community like Quebec? I think number one, it's a federal constitution. Sovereignty is divided. So for all provinces, including the province of Quebec, there are significant anchors in terms of legislative powers and fiscal autonomy. So that's significant. The other thing I would say is it's not a constitution that contains any language on the nation, unlike Spain's, right? So the Canadian Constitution is largely agnostic as to what is the nation, where are the nations, how does this all work? It doesn't speak to that. Partly as a reflection of that, but also partly here I will say maybe as a result of the wisdom of our judiciary, the Supreme Court of Canada and lower courts have not tried to specify a specific vision of the country in terms of nations anyway, right? And in fact, the Supreme Court of Canada has basically stated that there exist different understandings of the country, and it hasn't sought to really position itself on there. So I think that's something very valuable in a multinational state. Citizens having the notion that courts are legitimate, and citizens accepting court decisions, whatever they are. You might know that, a lot of us here know that in 1998, the Canadian Supreme Court was asked if Quebec could become independent, and so on and so forth. And in its reference on secession, it answered the question, and it basically said it's a political act. It's not that it's allowed or not allowed. It's a political act. It can happen. It should respect these principles, the rule of law, federalism, minority rights, democracy. And what struck me, I still remember that day, 1998, and you have strong supporter of independence going on TV, strong opponents of independence going on TV and saying, this judgment is great, right? They both said that. So I think that's something that is very valuable and has allowed Canada to survive in a sense. And on Jaime's second question on autonomy, autonomy in Quebec is more of a discursive term, if you will. It doesn't correspond to a particular constitutional or institutional status like it does here in Puerto Rico, right? We have really no such thing as ELA. Constitutionally, Quebec is 1 unit out of 10 in the Federation. Now, there is no recognition of nationhood in the Constitution, as I mentioned before, but the workings of Canadian federalism have really allowed Quebec to be, treated differently than other provinces because often it wants different things, so that flexibility is there. Now, as the polarization between opponents and supporters of independence has decreased over the last couple of decades, and a new party has emerged, basically saying, we don't want independence, and we're not federalists in the sense that federalists are those who oppose independence. We're autonomist. We're nationalist, and we're autonomous. In Quebec, politically, it's very important to say you're nationalist. If not, you don't go anywhere politically, because saying you're a nationalist means you're going to prioritize Quebec over everything else, right? And that's your first currency as a politician. Now, after that, you have to say, okay, what do you want to do with this nationalism? What are you going to do for the Quebec nation, right? And the politics in Quebec now is, we're going to look to maximize the autonomy of Quebec within the Federation. We're going to look to maximize the decentralization of the Federation without considering independence. So we oppose the status quo, we oppose independence, so we will work without the threat of independence to maximize the autonomy of the province. So that's kind of where politics is at. And, again, it's completely surprising that it has come to this. So it's important in the case of these internal national communities, these minority nations, to understand that things do change along the spectrum of kind of self-determination preferences.
Sí, muy rápidamente. Acerca de la primera pregunta que me ha dirigido el profesor Luc, a ver, sí, yo considero muy importante y en Cataluña estamos muy orgullosos que ya hace más de 20 años que tenemos, nos gusta decirlo así, una estructura de Estado que es un centro que hace encuestas públicas que pone a disposición no solo para la clase política, para los partidos políticos, sino para el mundo académico y por lo tanto también, y además al conjunto de la sociedad, periodistas, think tanks o cualquier persona interesada en saber qué piensan. La ley de Cataluña establece máxima transparencia y eso se aprovecha. Por lo tanto, son de una alta utilidad pública, saber qué piensan tus conciudadanos para luego tú tomar tus propias decisiones acerca de los temas que mueven la sociedad. Es importante tener encuestas de calidad que sean consensuadas en el sentido de aceptadas, independientemente de los resultados que muestren, que pueden agradar más o menos. Respecto a la segunda pregunta, hay un punto importante que es lo que pasó en la historia del catalanismo. Básicamente estaba comprometido en la gobernabilidad de España, en la defensa de la personalidad de Cataluña y de los intereses materiales de Cataluña, pero estaban implicados en la gobernabilidad de España y aprovecharon al máximo esta intervención cuando era posible en un contexto democrático. A raíz de las mayorías absolutas del Partido Popular y de la sentencia del Tribunal Constitucional y la práctica del Estado funcionando, los autónomos funcionando, por una gran parte de ese sector que apostaba por una negociación constante con el gobierno español de turno, el que fuera, llegó al convencimiento que se tenía que cambiar de paradigma, se tenía que llegar a establecer unas reglas del juego nuevas en un marco del nuevo estatuto que determinaran mejor las competencias de Cataluña y para evitar la interferencia constante de los poderes centrales. Esto no fue posible, quedó abortado el estatuto de autonomía vigente, es un papel que no tiene mucha trascendencia, pero es el que rige el sistema político, en este caso de Cataluña. Hay una mayoría pues, de esta gente que ha quedado desencantada y ha optado pues, por la vía de la independencia, es decir, no tenemos más alternativa que luchar por la independencia desde una perspectiva democrática. Entienden ellos que España es un Estado irreformable, la Constitución no se puede reformar, es imposible por la rigidez de los procedimientos y además la percepción que el hecho diferencial que se dice de Cataluña es malentendido a pesar de años y años de pedagogía política para explicar las cosas. En Cataluña la voluntad de independencia está repartida mitad y mitad, grosso modo, más o menos oscilaciones temporales. En el conjunto del Estado, el resto de los españoles, el 75% está en contra de la independencia de Cataluña y lo percibe además con una identidad muy organicista. La gente dice es como si me imputaran, o sea que es una cosa muy dura. En Cataluña hay, en cambio, sí una gran unanimidad, bueno, unanimidad tampoco, pero una gran mayoría, al 70-80% de gente que considera dos cosas. Primero, que el estatus final de Cataluña se tiene que acordar entre los catalanes, ellos decidiendo, y segundo, que el resultado que salga será aceptable. En esta encuesta hicimos una pregunta que le preguntamos, ¿y si hubiera un referéndum legal y acordado en Cataluña y los catalanes decidieran la independencia, ¿usted aceptaría o no aceptaría el resultado? En Cataluña el 80% dijo que sí. En España la mayoría dijo, el 53% dijo que sí, pero incluía a los catalanes que son fuertes en esto. En el resto de España el 48% dijo que sí, que aceptaría, pero un 44% dijo que no aceptaría el resultado del referéndum. Eso es un problema muy importante, porque si legal y acordado, que quiere decir aceptado por el gobierno español con el visto bueno del Tribunal Constitucional, y el resultado no se acepta la independencia de Cataluña, el margen que queda pues es francamente preocupante. Y esto nos llevaría a hablar de calidad democrática, de las culturas políticas, pero ya sería más complicado. A veces, desde sectores importantes del catalanismo, acaban pensando que una metáfora, una analogía, con todo mi respeto, que es como una especie de cena en la cual hay lobos y una oveja y tienen que decir en común qué hay para cenar, ¿no? Y los catalanes un poco se encuentran así. Los lobos y la oveja deciden qué hay para cenar, y con lo cual la perspectiva es pues no muy buena. Muchas gracias.
Gracias, Jordi. I'm going to take questions from the audience. There's a lot for Scotland, but I'll try to transform them into questions that maybe all of you can take a stab at. The first one is very interesting. It's particular to Scotland, but it also speaks to a good question for all of you, which is, and it comes from Professor Chugo Quintero. I met Winfrey Evans around 30 years ago when he was president of the Welsh Nationalist Party. He told me that as a student he was president of the internationalist movement. Please comment on the relationship between nationalism and internationalism in the UK, and we can extend that perhaps to the other jurisdictions. Let me raise another question. So this one has to do with the importance of academic debates in these movements that you've just described. And it's particular to the Quebecois authors, but I would like to also extend it to all of you, to what extent these debates, these academic debates, are actually shaping, and in what ways, these positions as well as the political movements themselves, if in any way. And I'll say the third one, and then we can open it up for a conversation. This comes from the sociological field, and it proposes that there may be another paradigm, which is the comprador elite, which is the private sector, which is a dominant class, for example, in Puerto Rico, which controls and administers the colony to maintain its privileges through oligopolies and the like. And to what extent elites are also shaping a lot of these discussions, and in what ways are they influencing these processes? And if you could all just chime in to some of these questions. Thank you.
I'll start then. One thing I would say, first of all, is talk a little bit about Wales, because it wasn't in your list, Jaime, and I think it should be, because there's changes taking place in Wales also on the back of Brexit, and a much greater awareness of its own distinctiveness and its dissatisfaction with the constitutional status quo. So there are really interesting developments taking place there. On the question about the relationship between nationalism and internationalism, I think this is really interesting. And in the UK right now, we have competing forms of nationalism. So we have a British nationalism that is not internationalist, that is quite inward-looking, and almost sort of, articulating a vision of nationhood that if it existed at all was, 50 years old. Even then, probably not. But it's quite a sort of, bounded version of the nation that is sovereign, wholly sovereign, and not sharing that sovereignty. In Scotland, nationalism is articulated in a very different way. I am certain that if you asked her the question, Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister, would say that she was nationalist and internationalist. She would see no contradiction between these things. And it talks to your point about academic debates influencing these things. The SNP was heavily influenced by Professor Neil McCormack, a constitutional lawyer, and also an activist and advisor, and for a short time elected member for the SNP as well. But they were very influenced by his ideas of post-sovereignty and the idea that you can be independent and share that power and share that sovereignty and thereby be enhanced by that, particularly within the context of the European Union. So I think in 2014, that wasn't really understood in Brussels very much. In Brussels, it was, how can you be pro-independence? And this is anathema to the project of European integration, where I think they understand it a bit better now. But we'll see if that goes anywhere.
Nicola, could I ask you a quick counter question?
Yes.
Just for our own education here. Because I've been to a couple of PSA conferences in the UK in years past. And what is the difference between Britishness and Englishness? Because I've never quite understood what is the difference.
So historically, if you asked people in surveys, in England, they didn't really treat them very differently. The terms were used interchangeably. Now there is much more awareness, since devolution actually, there is much more awareness in England of its identity as a nation within the United Kingdom. So there is more of a distinction now, but it's really interesting because when you ask people if they are British, if they feel British, that means something different in the different parts of the United Kingdom. In England, those who identify as British more than English much more closely resemble in their attitudes those who in Scotland and Wales identify as Scottish and Welsh. So it is a peculiar thing in a multinational state that national identity is very complex and it is very plural, and I think it becomes a bit problematic when political elites try to pin it down. So that the ambiguity and the plurality is a strength of a multinational democracy.
We have a few minutes left, but I'd like to give Jordi and Andrea just a chance to comment on some of these questions, please.
Yeah, I'll take the one on academia and politicians in Quebec and Canada. I think there's important networks between Quebec academics and politicians. I'll give you a very concrete example. The notion of asymmetry. So as Quebec could no longer be recognized as distinct in the Constitution, Quebec academics coined the term asymmetrical federalism. The notion that Canada is constitutionally 10 equal provinces, equal in standing and status, but perhaps in practice, because Quebec governments want powers that in the rest of the country, other provinces are comfortable having exercised by the federal government, perhaps we could conceptualize the Canadian Federation as asymmetrical. If Quebec wants to choose a lot of its immigrants and other provinces don't, then maybe we could allow for that. And that's really an academically designed concept which found its way into politics because of the networks with academia. And then Quebec politicians were claiming we want asymmetric federalism in Canada, right? And then I don't want to go on your territory, Jordi, but there's also very close relationships between Quebec and Catalan intellectuals and politicians, and the term asymmetric federalism is very Quebecois, and even in the way that it's migrated into Catalonia and other minority nations. So that's a very concrete example, and there's lots of those as well. And of course, there are academics that have become politicians, and also vice versa sometimes, which kind of helps facilitate this kind of transfer.
Thank you, Jordi.
A ver, muy rápidamente. En el caso de Cataluña, relativo al tema de la internalización, disculpad, el catalanismo históricamente se ha manifestado muy pro-europeo y ha jugado la carta pro-europea muy intensamente, y siempre ha sido el catalanismo mayoritario, ha expresado siempre ha empujado siempre para que España, el Estado español, se integre en Europa. Quizás con un deseo que al final del trayecto fuera posible lo que se llama una ampliación interna, es decir, que Cataluña se convirtiera en un Estado dentro de una Europa unida, como en los casos de secesión interna que hubo en Vermont o en Suiza, en Jura. Sería al final del trayecto, pero la idea de superar el Estado español para triangular un poco más es importantísimo. En cuanto al problema de las élites, el catalanismo es básicamente un movimiento mesocrático de clases medias. Las élites están comprometidas en el Estado español de una manera muy firme, con lo cual es un movimiento básicamente de clase media popular. Pero también tenemos una presencia importante de clase trabajadora, que son gente que ha venido del resto del Estado. Cataluña, a diferencia de otros casos que tenemos, es un país de inmigración. El 64% de la población de Cataluña ha nacido en Cataluña, pero tenemos el 21% que ha nacido fuera del Estado, 21%, y el 15% en el resto del Estado. Con lo cual es un panorama bastante diferente de otros casos que tenemos. Eso hace que la sociedad catalana, el nacionalismo sea, quizás por necesidad, muy cívico. Intentar construir valores comunes basados en criterios democráticos, reteniendo, eso sí, la importancia de la lengua como elemento unificador de diversidad de personas que ya vienen de todo el mundo. En este sentido, el ejemplo de los Estados Unidos nos gusta, ¿no? Como el inglés, como lengua materna, lengua común de los habitantes de la Federación. Por tanto, el caso de Cataluña es también diferente de los otros. Hubo un tiempo, y acabó, Puerto Rico era un referente para el independentismo catalán. Llegaron a plantear el desideratum que fuéramos un Estado libre asociado al Reino de España. Con lo cual, eso de la política comprada, hay idas y vueltas, ¿no? Unos y otros van y otros vienen, y luego hemos ido al Canadá, nos hemos visto en Escocia, y la vía catalana la tenemos como la tenemos, ¿no? Pero bueno, hay esta incomodidad permanente de una parte no negligible de la población catalana que intenta encontrar un modo de acomodo que es difícil.
Nos traiciona el tiempo. We've run out of time. There's several more questions. I'll just give them out to you later on in the hallway. But please join me in thanking our panelists, our commentators, And we'll move on to the next panel. Don't go away, please.
Muchísimas gracias a los panelistas, ha sido fascinante y vamos a seguir profundizando. Vamos a pasar al próximo panel, identidades políticas y pluralismo territorial, federalismo, trumpismo en Estados Unidos y autonomismo en Francia. Vamos a estar hablando de la cultura política de Estados Unidos, vamos a hablar de otra isla, de Córcega, y vamos a hablar del concepto de federalismo. Nuevamente vamos a contar con la participación del profesor Yush como comentarista. Yo estaré moderando en esta ocasión. Recuerden anotar sus preguntas en los papeles. Vamos a comenzar. Gracias a Dios que yo tengo esta voz que tengo y yo sé que todos ustedes me escucharon, pero lo repito, vamos a empezar con el profesor Smith. If you could go to the podium. El profesor Smith es profesor emérito de Ciencia Política de la Universidad de Pensilvania. Adelante.
I came the shortest distance of any of the panelists, so my Achilles tendon decided to make it a little more challenging. I want to start with my profound thanks to all the organizers, especially Jaime Luch, Jennifer Wolf, and C&E, for the invitation to be with you today. Despite my mouthful of a title, the gist of my talk can be simply stated. It draws on the American constitutional law and American politics paradigms that Jaime has criticized, but it points to, beyond them, to how political recognition of a different paradigm might become possible. That's surprising because one might expect that the conservative nationalist movement that has arisen under the leadership of Donald Trump would be hostile to changing the status of Puerto Rico, especially to recognizing it as a distinct nation within a multinational American democracy or outside it. So far, that has been the case. But as Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch showed in his concurrence in U.S. versus Valle Madero earlier this year, there are themes in contemporary national conservative thought that can be used to challenge Puerto Rico's current status. Consequently, there's a possibility, not a probability, but a possibility that the Supreme Court, shaped by Donald Trump, might overturn the early 20th century insular cases that wrongly bestowed constitutional legitimacy on Puerto Rico's colonial positioning, thereby reopening the constitutional questions about Puerto Rico's status. On Monday, the Supreme Court declined one opportunity to do so, thereby compelling me to modify this talk. But that case involved an issue, birthright citizenship, that the justices may understandably want to avoid, especially since they would have had to overrule the government of American Samoa. It remains imaginable that they'll reconsider the insular cases in another context, and that's because some partisans of the Trump movement have new hopes of winning Puerto Rican as well as other Hispanic voters, so they might, in the end, support some significant changes in Puerto Rico's status, though just what changes, if any, are very uncertain. Still, it's a possibility worth considering. The green one at the top? Got it. Let me start by noting that, as I'm sure you're all aware, one of the most striking comparative political developments in recent years has been the rise to power of nationalist movements, often claiming to be populist, often authoritarian, in countries such as Hungary, India, Brazil, and many others, including the America First movement that put Donald Trump in the White House in 2016 and that has ceaselessly tried since 2020 to put him back there, apparently by any means necessary. Somewhat ironically, nationalist conservatives in different countries have formed transnational alliances reinforcing each other in the insistence that each nation should be fully sovereign, entitled to chart its own course without hindrance from international agencies, laws, or norms. So international law documents condemning colonialism are easily dismissed by this crowd. But there is more to their outlook. In the U.S., for the last few years, pro-Trump national conservatives have gathered each year in a national conservative conference. And this year, they rallied around a document, National Conservatism, a Statement of Principles, written primarily by American conservatives, but joined by leading national conservative voices from Portugal, Poland, Canada, the UK, Israel, Hungary, France, Austria, and other locales. Its American signers included representatives of most major conservative intellectual centers, including the Conservative Partnership Institute, the Heritage Foundation, National Review, the Manhattan Institute, the Hudson Institute, Turning Point USA, the Claremont Institute, the Edinburgh Foundation, and many more. They're funded by the billionaire Peter Thiel, amongst others. Because in office, Donald Trump lashed out against Puerto Rico and opposed aid to it, because he disparaged the notion of Puerto Rican statehood, because he also vehemently denounced especially Hispanic immigrants from Mexico and Central and South America, because he promised not new reforms but to make America great again, because many Puerto Ricans are Democrats and Trump opposes anything that might endanger his chances for power. It's reasonable to doubt that Donald Trump himself will ever support changes in Puerto Rico's status, whether toward statehood, independence, or a significant measure of self-governing powers. But except on a few core issues, Trump can be unpredictable, and he may not be at the head of the MAGA movement in the future. The leading contender at the moment to take his place, Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida, is one of several Florida Republicans, including Senators Marco Rubio and Rick Scott, who have declared themselves receptive to Puerto Rican statehood. They've done so because more than 1 million Puerto Ricans who have moved to Florida in recent years are a critical constituency, as Hispanic voters are in many other swing states. And because Republicans probably cannot win nationally without carrying Florida, the Puerto Rican voters there figure strongly in the strategy of the Republican Party as a whole. Moreover, lots of Puerto Ricans are not liberal Democrats. As you know, the current Puerto Rican Representative Commissioner, the elected non-voting representative of Puerto Rico to Congress, Jennifer Gonzalez Colon, is a Republican and a Trump supporter among her other political identities. So there may be growing Republican support for reconsidering Puerto Rico's status going forward, even though such support is not there in the current Congress. It's also noteworthy that the largely pro-Trump national conservative intellectuals who sought to craft a coherent statement of principles for their movement took some positions that can provide a rationale for why conservatives should be open to change in regards to Puerto Rico. While championing strong nationalism, they denounced imperialism, and they recommended the Federalist Principle, which prescribes a delegation of power to the respective states or subdivisions of the nation so as to allow greater variation, experimentation, and freedom, though they also said that in those states or subdivisions in which lawlessness, immorality, and dissolution reign, national government must intervene energetically to restore order. And they said that all men are created in the image of God. No person's worth or loyalties can be judged by the shape of his features or the color of his skin. They said the nationalism we espouse respects and indeed combines the unique needs of particular minority communities and the common good of the nation as a whole. Admittedly, those declarations fell short of a willingness to embrace a multinational democracy. That comes hard for champions of unified nationalism. Still, for younger conservatives like Rehan Salam, the American-born, Bangladeshi-descended 42-year-old president of the Manhattan Institute, these premises show that national conservatism can and should be at least a multi-ethnic and multicultural conservatism in which different communities can maintain many distinctive cultural traditions and practices so long as they're loyal to the American nation and to what conservatives take to be its economic and political principles. Indeed, many national conservatives insist strongly that it's the radical identity politics of the American left, not national conservatism, that is racist today. Some in the nationalist conservative movement in America are eager for issues and actions through which they can vindicate that claim, showing that they are more inclusive and more accepting of diversity than the racist and sexist conservatives in the nation's past. Earlier this year, we got an indication that there may be at least one Trump appointee on the U.S. Supreme Court who may share this strain of national conservative thought to some degree, and who might act on it, possibly in concert with the court's liberals, especially Justice Sonia Sotomayor. To be sure, the case, U.S. versus Madero, was an 8-1 decision in which the court held that the Constitution does not require residents of Puerto Rico to receive supplemental security income or other federal benefits on the same basis as residents of the states. The court affirmed that Congress can treat Puerto Ricans differently from state residents, both when Congress is imposing taxes and when Congress is spending funds raised through various federal taxes. Only Justice Sotomayor dissented. She contended that the ruling permitted a neglect of needy persons in Puerto Rico that was antithetical both to the aims of federal benefit programs and to the equal protection component of the Fifth Amendment's due process clause. So the opinion overall upheld the current constitutional status of Puerto Rico. Yet, even though Trump appointee Neil Gorsuch concurred with the result, he too attacked the insular cases, which in his reading held that the federal government could rule Puerto Rico and other territories largely without regard to the Constitution. Gorsuch contended it is past time to acknowledge the gravity of this error and admit what we know to be true. The insular cases have no foundation in the Constitution and rest instead on racial stereotypes. They deserve no place in our law. Gorsuch said he joined the court's opinion because no party asked us to overrule the insular cases today. They all agreed that the due process clause was one part of the Constitution that did apply to Puerto Rico, but they disagreed about what the clause required. But Gorsuch expressed hope that the court would soon get a case challenging the insular cases and that the court squarely would overrule them. One of the cases he mentioned, Fitzsimonu versus U.S., is one in which I joined in amicus briefs urging that the insular cases be overturned and that persons born in the territories be held to be birthright citizens under the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, not just citizens as a result of alterable congressional legislation. A lower federal court ruled in our favor, but the decision was overturned on appeal, and Monday the Supreme Court decided it would not review that ruling. That may indicate that the justices are not willing to consider the insular cases, despite the pleas of Justices Gorsuch and Sotomayor. But again, it could be they were avoiding 14th Amendment birthright citizenship, which is highly contentious in American immigration debates, as well as not wanting to overrule American Samoan governing officials. But why might the court possibly ever take a related case challenging the insular cases? Why might it overturn them? I'm not predicting either of those things will occur, but the justices do have some reasons to go in that direction. Especially after its Dobbs decision overturning Roe versus Wade, the court is not only less popular, it is less widely seen as legitimate than at any time since we began polling on the question. Many Americans question whether its members are committed to justice for all, and many suspect that a majority of its members simply favor the partisan interests of modern conservative Republicans. Most of the current justices defend the legitimacy of their decisions by saying they decide issues in accord with the original public meaning of the Constitution at the time when its provisions were adopted. But as Justice Gorsuch stressed, the insular cases rest on a distinction between incorporated and unincorporated territories that was simply not part of the public meaning of the Constitution's territory clause when the Constitution was adopted. The distinction was crafted much later in the 1890s, advanced chiefly by a Harvard political scientist, A. Lawrence Lowell, who offered it explicitly so that the territories newly acquired in the Spanish-American War, whose residents, including Puerto Ricans, were seen as racially distinct from white Americans, could not claim full constitutional protections. So the court has powerful institutional reasons today to try to show that it takes original public meaning seriously, that it does not uphold racism, and that it does not always rule consistently with the current partisan interests of conservative Republicans. These factors make its overturning the insular cases conceivable. So far, the Biden administration isn't challenging the insular cases, but that's partly because most Americans don't know any of this is going on. If there's lots of publicity accusing Biden of favoring racist precedents, it's not hard to imagine the Biden Justice Department abandoning any defense of the insular cases, making it easier for 5 justices to vote to overturn them. That's all the more true when we ask what would be the consequences of overturning the insular cases. The answer is it's not clear, and maybe it wouldn't be much. Such a ruling would mean that all of the Constitution does apply in full force to Puerto Rico. It would mean that persons born in Puerto Rico would have constitutional 14th Amendment-based citizenship, not statute-based citizenship. But some scholars believe that Puerto Ricans already have 14th Amendment birthright citizenship. I disagree, but the court might affirm that. And remember, in the Madero case, the court agreed the due process clause applied to the Constitution, and it did apply to Puerto Rico, and it didn't prevent Puerto Rico from getting different treatment. Nonetheless, overruling the insular cases would revive a lot of questions that the earlier insular cases addressed about whether Congress is prevented from imposing distinctive taxes and custom duties on Puerto Rico by Article 1, Section 8, and if this were held to mean that Congress cannot treat Puerto Ricans differently from mainland residents for any tax purposes, it would undermine part of the court's rationale for its results in Madero, which again held that since Puerto Ricans don't pay all the same taxes, they don't have to receive all the same benefits. It would undercut the long-standing bargain under which Puerto Ricans don't pay federal income taxes, but they also don't vote in federal congressional or presidential elections. If Puerto Ricans had to pay all federal taxes, many might very reasonably insist that they should have federal voting rights. No taxation without representation is a very old theme in American politics. And I want to stress that at the current moment, the state of U.S. politics is volatile. It's possible that the Republicans won't gain control of one or both houses of Congress, and if they do, they may not retain that control in 2024. And as I've reviewed, there are more Republicans who have some receptivity to winning Puerto Rican votes in key states, and so it is conceivable that the conservative movement might support the unexpected, just as Neil Gorsuch appears eager for the Supreme Court to do. Let me close by stressing that none of this may happen. There may be no consideration or overruling of the insular cases, and if they're overruled, it might not change the status quo. And I'm also not trying to make the Trumpist national conservative vision for America and the world appear more attractive to you. I find it deeply objectionable on many grounds. But it's a major force in modern American and global politics. So it's important to understand it as fully as we can. What I've tried to highlight is that today's national conservatism may have more potential than most analysts think to support challenges to the current status of Puerto Rico. If those challenges occur, and if they bring about significant changes, the results will be vitally important for Puerto Ricans and for all Americans, and they will probably be an influential model for efforts to build not just multicultural, but multinational democracies in other countries and regions around the world.
Thank you, Professor Smith. Jaime? Sorry.
Well, thank you very much, Rogers. I hope you're all right. I just want to mention that again, like in some of the other visitors, I've known Roger Smith since 1998 when I began the PhD program at Yale University, and so it's very pleasant to have his visit here today. Now, regarding my two comments, you might call them, provocative appetizers or whatever. The first one, I'm going to adjust a little bit. I think the aim of the first one is that I'm, as you are, of course, a major figure in political science, your views on what Trumpism is. I have my own views, but I'm very interested in your own views. And because I think, of course, that to some extent, whatever Trumpism is, which is what I would like you to talk about, I am sure is going to affect and will continue to affect the island of Puerto Rico. So, so the way I framed the question originally, I was thinking of an article of yours, too old, more than 20 years old, and I was thinking of how you would think Trumpism fits into this one idea you had many years ago about the multiple traditions in U.S. political culture. But I read something more recent last night. Your article on white protectionism in America, in Perspectives on Politics from last year, very recent article with Desmond King. So in this article, as I understand it, you say or you write that well, Trumpism and Trump can be at least three different things. One possibility is that Trump is a proponent of white nationalism. Another possibility is that Trump somehow holds an emergent third position. He might be a leader who promises to protect whites against the rising tide of unjust treatment. And so, as I understand it, you think Trump is more the latter than the former. So, and as you said right in the article, Trump is neither an explicit white nationalist nor a true adherent to color blindness. He is instead a white protectionist. So I would like, for the education of our audience, if you could explain to us a little more what you mean by this. You know, how do you see Trumpism? Because Trumpism will continue after he goes off to retire in Costa Rica or something else. And so we'd be interested in that. The second question is even more important. I mean, this actually goes beyond Puerto Rico. I'm very concerned about the future of liberal democracy. Democracy versus authoritarianism makes a very big difference. Liberal democracy has many problems, right? Insufficiencies, but authoritarianism is far worse. So the question is, and the comment is, how worried are you about the future of liberal democracy in the USA? Are we in 1860 in the US history, or the 1930s in Europe, or not? And if indeed US democracy is, as I believe it is, at a very critical juncture, how does this obviously affect Puerto Rico? Because I think it's going to affect, and its prospects for becoming, maybe, who knows, the 51st state of the Federation.
Muchas gracias, Jaime. Preguntas críticas. I'm going to ask Professor Fassi to go to the podium. André Fassi es el próximo. Él es profesor de Ciencia Política de la Universidad de Córcega, Pascale Paoli.
Muchas gracias. Estoy muy encantado de estar aquí. Agradezco muchísimo a Jaime Luque, al CNE. Es un viaje especial para mí. My communications deals with the Corsican political situations, which has dramatically evolved since the 1960s. We observe an increasingly salient opposition between a unitary state, France, which seeks to make as few concessions as possible to its unitary foundations, and the political movement, nationalist, which asserts the existence of a Corsican nation, of a distinct political community with a high inherent political right, and particularly the right to decide its political present and future. This movement claims several exceptions to French unitary principles and relies on a democratic legitimacy which is now unique in Europe. Last year, in the last territorial elections, Corsican nationalists won 68% of the votes, more than counterparts in Scotland, Catalonia, Basque Country, of South Tyrol. And in order to understand, we need to retrace the history of Corsica's integration into France. This is a tale of a recent paradigm shift, yet with moderate effects. Corsica, which had never been an independent political entity, experienced a powerful nationalist mobilization in the 18th century. No? No. Excuse me. Okay, historical roots. In the 18th century, initiated an actual state-building process, and this process has been internationally famous, especially thanks to Rousseau and his social contract. Corsicans revolted against the Republic of Genoa, which was their ruler for 5 centuries. However, Genoa was still sovereign in law and has conceded the exercise of this sovereignty to France in 1768. Corsicans refused to be sold like animals, and France needed a 1-year military conquest and many years of heavy repression. During the French Revolution, France and Corsica first enjoyed a honeymoon, but Corsicans declared secession in 1793 and called on the other superpower of the time to found a short-lived Anglo-Corsican kingdom. Despite all that, the integrations into France did not suffer any more nationalist mobilizations in the 19th century. One does not meet any more mobilizations or intellectual productions based on the Corsican national idea. However, the integration was far from easy. Corsica had very serious public order problems and very strong exceptions to national law at the linguistic, economic, judicial, or fiscal levels. The most famous exception was its special customs status, which lasted until 1912. So the absence of nationalist contestation at this time was quite surprising, because Corsica combined several factors related to the presence of nationalist mobilizations, particularly the geographical rupture, the experience of independence, and cultural difference. In 1915, 85% of the children had the Corsican language as mother tongue. Nevertheless, this was not a kind of passive resistance. On the contrary, Corsicans were over-involved in the French colonial adventures. The key to the integration process was the total support of the Corsican notables. In an archaic, rural, poorly educated and industrialized society, these notables were crucial brokers between the state and island society, distributing state resources to ensure social consensus and population's loyalty. This system had been unchallenged until First World War. In the interwar period, a first autonomous mobilization carried by intellectuals had an interesting cultural impact, but it refused to run for elections and lost all credit because of certain sympathies for Italian fascism. So the current nationalist movement is thus a contemporary one. Its emergence had been the unintended product of a modernization process designed by the state. The 1957 Regional Action Plan, yes, action plan, based on farming and tourism development, was supposed to allow a Corsican renaissance. Huh? The green, yes. Okay. It's better, thanks. To allow a Corsican renaissance, but produced various anxieties and frustrations. On the economic level, the program actually promoted segregation. In farming, the preference given to repatriates from North Africa was obvious through very favorable bank loans and land distribution. By 1964, only 29% of pieces of land had been given to local farmers, bolstering the resentment of natives. On the identity level, the program caused a demographic trouble. Corsica had lost, it's incredible, about 40% of its population in the previous 60 years. This is about 120,000 inhabitants, while 15,000 inhabitants, 50,000 repatriates began settling there. In addition, the tourism development was also based on an immigrant workforce, and external financial groups designed huge projects. And all this fueled the idea of a danger for the Corsican language, land, and identity. On the political level, the competition was extremely close. dominated by two major networks of notables. This system, based on interpersonal and clientelistic ties, was sclerotic, while all the Western world was shaken by emerging values. Moreover, the modernization process was driven in a very centralized way, and this called into question the real influence of Corsican notables. So the first regionalist organizations appeared in 1963-1964, were based on denouncing the regional action plan. Their electoral results were disappointing. However, they managed to gather a significant militant force and carry out a relevant mobilization. This early regionalism was inspired by the status of Italian regions and did not portray itself as the enemy of French unity. No, the real threat to French unity would have been the state of abandonment of Corsica. Nevertheless, we observe a first radicalization in 1973, mainly because the state was unable to accept very moderate claims. On the one hand, public organizations gave up the regionalist idea and endorsed the nationalist one. They now assert the existence of a Corsican nation and its right to govern itself. Therefore, they claim a very broad autonomy, and they withdraw from elections, which they consider corrupted by fraud. On the other hand, the third significant clandestine organization appears, and the bombings will multiply. A second phase of radicalization began rapidly. In 1975, about 15 autonomists armed with hunting rifles occupied one cellar of a repatriate. They denounced the compromises of the state and the banks with the repatriates and demanded a redistribution of the land. The state reacted by mobilizing at least 1,200 agents with military equipment. 2 policemen were killed and 1 activist seriously injured. 5 days later, the government dissolved the autonomous organization, and Bastia, the second largest city in Corsica, experienced a night of clashes that left 1 policeman dead and 18 others wounded by bullets. From that point on, some activists considered that nothing could be discussed with the state. In 1976, the Corsica National Liberation Front appeared, bringing together the pre-existing clandestine organization and promoting independence, a claim which was previously very marginal. Above all, violence had a new status, from a subsidiary tool to an essential and indispensable one. For several years, this violence symbolized what has been called the Corsican problem. But this violence can hardly be compared with that carried out in Ulster and the Basque Country. Despite some 8,000 bombings, it was a very specific type of violence, much less intense. Corsican organizations never placed bombs in train stations or supermarkets. They are responsible for about 60 deaths, and moreover, 1/3 of these deaths were nationalists killed by their own bomb or in fratricidal confrontations during the 1990s. This violence decreased sharply in the 2000s, and in 2014, the main clandestine organization announced the cessation of its actions without disarming. Thus, risks of violence still exist. But the strength and legitimacy of Corsican nationalism are now based on the vote of citizens. The creation of Corsican Assembly in 1982 led to the return of nationalists to the electoral arena and fostered a slow but effective institutionalization process. The proportional representation system that was to be used was supposed to allow the nationalists to be easily represented and favored a change of perspective. From the 1990s onwards, the contentious repertoire was gradually abandoned in favor of institutional involvement. The push will be achieved in 2015, when a coalition of autonomists and independentists won for the first time with 35% of the votes, a relative majority in the Corsican Assembly. In 2017, the same coalition won more than 56% of the votes. Finally, last year, With a more fragmented offer of 4 nationalist lists in the first round, nationalism won 68% of the votes in the second round. Similarly, 6 years ago, Corsican nationalists had no MPs. Now they have 4 out of 6. At the local level, the progression is not so strong, but nationalist militants had the second and third municipalities of Corsica, as well as one of the 2 agglomeration communities. These victories require responses from the French government, and this will be natural. Since 1974, despite the use of violence, the state has sought accommodation with nationalism at least 7 times. However, it has never reached a sufficient level of consensus. The most obvious results were at the institutional level. Initially, I spoke about a paradigm shift, and this shift took place in 1982. We moved from the most advanced integration possible to differentiated regionalization. The differentiation process was developed 3 times, but without ever affecting the constitutional distribution of powers. In other words, it has been excluded to give the Corsican Assembly the power to adapt national laws and regulations to the situation of the island. The Corsican elected representatives only have the right to propose normative adaptations and to request to be authorized to adapt regulations. Yet, we had never seen any interesting results. In short, the foundations of the constitutional order have not been harmed, changes have always been moderate, and the institutional trajectory set in 1982 has remained the same. It is clearly a case of gradual institutional change. Anyway, since 2017, the Corsican question has been experiencing huge evolutions. The democratic legitimacy of nationalists has dramatically increased, but the government has resisted demands that breach French unitary foundations and that carry major political risks. During President Macron's first term, the government made a counter-proposal that included the constitutional revision, but was very far from these demands. The stalemate was total, generating frustrations that were violently expressed this March. And it is at that point that the government proposed opening discussions of autonomy, even mentioning the Polynesian model, which is exceptional, very different from French common law. This shift was essentially an attempt to appease violent protesters, but has not yet had any significant impact, and the troubled political context can upset the prospects. At the national level, the government is very far from having the parliamentary support necessary to revise the constitution. Moreover, it had rejected in advance some core demands, such as the co-officiality of Corsican language. At the Corsican level, the rivalries between nationalist parties undermines the organization of the dialogue. There are 4 major nationalist parties, but only one is in power, and the other 3 are inclined to be very critical and to defend maximalist positions. A compromise seems impossible today between those who defend institutional dialogue despite its limitations and those who want to return to protest politics. In sum, the number of regional and national veto players seems far too high to hope for a quick consensus on autonomy. However, the overall political stakes are high, and the absence of a real debate between Corsican representatives and the government could have very negative consequences, no matter which side we're on. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Jaime.
Grazie mille, André. I've known André since 2011 when he went to Oxford University, when I was at St. Anthony's College, and I organized a conference very similar to this one. So I'm glad to have him here. And I'm also fascinated by the case of Corsica, because I think more than some of the other cases here, there are some interesting similarities between Corsica and Puerto Rico. And of course, as everyone knows, a lot of migration came from Corsica to Puerto Rico, etc. But my first provocative appetizer is you maybe have covered it in your presentation, but here it goes. For over 20 years, I myself understood that Corsica has a form of autonomy within France. In fact, there are articles by experts such as Juan Lins who have portrayed Corsica as an autonomy. However, I do read often about Corsica. In the last year, in reaction to the extensive riots on the island after the death of Ivan Colonna, a nationalist prisoner in prison, the Minister of the Interior, Gérald Darmanin, visited the island and talked about autonomy, and there were some offers. So what is Darmanin talking about in terms of autonomy for Corsica, and how is that different from the status quo that the island has enjoyed for decades? That's what the first one. The second is also something you referenced, but the second is the following. As you may know, the national movement in Puerto Rico since the late 19th century has been divided between autonomists and independentists. In recent Corsican elections, we have seen that on December 10, 2017, a coalition of autonomists and secessionists together in Pe a Corsica, led by both Gilles Simeoni and Jean-Guy Talamoni, for the first time won an absolute majority of the Corsican Assembly with 41 out of 63 seats and 56.4% of the vote. Now, in the new elections of last July 1, 2021, Gilles Simeoni, running separately in Fa Populo as an autonomous formation, won another majority, as you well know. So the question is, why and how was the accord between autonomists and independentists possible in 2017, but apparently not in 2021? And also, by the way, I hope to do some field work in Corsica next year, definitely. So you will be my contact there. I hope to see you there next year.
Gracias, Jaime. Vamos a pasar ahora con la ponencia de Héctor López Bofil. Adelante al podio, por favor. López Bofil es profesor asociado de Derecho Constitucional de la Universidad Pompeu Fabra. Adelante.
Bueno, agregado. Soy profesor agregado, que es, Associate Professor in English, que sería como un titular. Bueno, es un absoluto placer para mí estar con ustedes aquí. Muchísimas gracias al Centro de la Nueva Economía por acogerme. Muchísimas gracias a Jaime Lluch, con el que nos une una larga amistad, por pensar en mí, para ofrecerles, el resultado de... aunque vengo de Cataluña, casi no hablaré de Cataluña, porque en estos momentos estoy implicado en una investigación sobre teoría del federalismo, que a su vez está anclada en una investigación sobre los orígenes de los conceptos que manejamos en derecho constitucional, los orígenes de los conceptos vinculados al rule of law, a la democracia mismo, al poder constituyente y al federalismo como uno de los puntales de las estructuras de limitación de poder. Entonces, mi propuesta para el día de hoy era hacer una reflexión sobre de dónde viene esto del federalismo. Claro, una aproximación esencialmente histórica que llegará hasta el momento presente de forma muy resumida, pero en la que espero de alguna forma que queden claros los elementos principales, las coordenadas principales en las que se mueve el federalismo y su historia. Bueno, básicamente tendríamos tres situaciones a través de las cuales se relacionan los grupos humanos, las entidades políticas. Una situación sería la de la conquista, la invasión, que más o menos hemos sufrido todos los pueblos. En estos momentos, pues en el este de Europa hay una guerra en la que justamente hay un conflicto territorial que podría resolverse en términos federales en el este de Ucrania. De hecho, así parecía vislumbrarse en los acuerdos de Minsk de 2014 y 2015. pero ninguno de los dos contendientes, y en particular Rusia, pues se ve lo suficientemente débil como para renunciar a la ocupación y a la invasión a través de medios bélicos. Este sería el primer escenario en el que no cabría federalismo, porque una de las partes se siente, o las dos, se sienten lo suficientemente fuertes para imponerse al otro, que ha sido una constante, por desgracia, frecuente en la historia de la humanidad. La otra situación sería en la que el imperio colapsa, ¿no? Entonces, cuando colapsa el imperio, las partes lo que hacen no es buscar un pacto federal, lo que buscan es salir del imperio rápido, ¿no? Que sería justamente la situación pues, que se dio ante el colapso de la Unión Soviética, ante el colapso de Yugoslavia, que es el secesionismo, ¿no? Rápidamente te constituyes en una entidad independiente y te alejas lo más posible de los antiguos dominadores. Claro, entonces el federalismo, ¿dónde surge el federalismo? Pues entre estos dos polos, ¿no? Entre el imperialismo puro y el secesionismo. Por eso yo llamo al federalismo el pacto entre los débiles. Se llega al federalismo porque ni uno es lo suficientemente fuerte como para imponerse al otro, y el otro tampoco no es lo suficientemente fuerte como para salir del imperio. Es en esta delicada franja, en esta delgada franja, que se mueve el pacto federal. Con lo cual, ya avanzo, ¿no? Que cualquier resolución de un conflicto territorial de esta especie pues, tiene que contar con estas premisas. Ni el centro puede ser muy fuerte, ni la periferia puede ser lo suficientemente fuerte como para salir. Bueno, esto se percibe desde los propios orígenes de la idea del federalismo, ¿no? Porque esto, ¿de dónde viene? Bueno, pues los primeros, como casi todo lo que manejamos en ciencia política, pues esto viene de Grecia y de Roma, ¿no? Y uno de los primeros usos de la palabra foedus, que quiere decir pacto entre iguales, alianza, se produjo justamente cuando el Imperio Romano pues estaba en una situación insostenible, en la que pues iban viniendo los invasores, y en particular pues hubo una de estas invasiones de los pueblos del norte, de estas invasiones bárbaras, que básicamente constituida por el pueblo de los visigodos, que fue al final el que fue a parar a la península ibérica, que no se les ocurrió otra cosa que plantar cara a los romanos, al Imperio Romano, en una batalla en el 378 después de Cristo, en el que mataron al emperador, el emperador de entonces, Valente, ¿no? Es como si ahora hubiese una guerra, una invasión, y pues fuese Biden comandante en jefe y los bárbaros lo liquidasen, ¿no? Claro, entonces los romanos dijeron, bueno, pues ya no somos tan fuertes, ¿no? ¿Y qué hicieron? Pues lo que hicieron fue pactar con los bárbaros y le admitieron que se instalasen en el imperio, ¿no? Y esto esto lo hizo el que sucedió a Valente, que fue Teodosio, que no tuvo más remedio que llegar a algún acuerdo con ellos, ¿no? Y hasta que luego los bárbaros fueron muchos y acabaron invadiendo el imperio y creando sus propios reinos. Bueno, pues esto es el foedus, el pacto entre los débiles, y en el mundo contemporáneo pues también ha sido así, ¿no? Bueno, si unos señores en Filadelfia decidieron apostar por una federación en 1787 fue porque se veían débiles, ¿no? Acababan de salir de una guerra de independencia, una guerra que podía estallar, como de hecho sucedió a principios del siglo XIX de nuevo, revueltas internas, y decidieron, bueno, pues aquí tenemos que trasladar el poder a una entidad superior. Y esta constante se reproduce en los distintos escenarios que analizo en mi paper, que por cierto el paper está en inglés, pero bueno, la conferencia la imparto en castellano, que es el que aparece aquí, ¿no? Federalism as a Compact Among the Weak. Y en el mundo contemporáneo, pues tenemos distintas variantes de estados que ahora mismo podríamos estar analizando aquí, que bueno, que ya aprovecho para decirlo. Federalismo en la República Federal de Alemania en 1949, bueno, es después de la Segunda Guerra Mundial, en la que la República Federal, Alemania está destrozada y los aliados imponen un sistema a un pueblo derrotado y dividen el país en estados, los Länder, y esencialmente en una situación muy débil que también en este momento está sufriendo Italia. Es decir, que Italia, Italia en el año 43, cuando los aliados desembarcan en Sicilia, un poco lo mismo, es un país fragmentado, en guerra, y es cuando las regiones periféricas aprovechan para culminar un proceso, para iniciar y para reforzarse como estados autónomos, y es cuando las regiones logran sus estatutos de autonomía especial, algunas regiones, entre ellas Sicilia, como alternativa para atajar el secesionismo siciliano, y serán estos estatutos especiales, de regiones especiales, los que se consolidarán desde el principio de la República Italiana en la Constitución de diciembre de 1947. La Unión Europea, o las comunidades europeas, lo mismo. Pensamos, bueno, ¿cómo es posible que de repente enemigos encarnizados se unan en un proceso de integración? Pues bueno, porque por la profunda debilidad de los miembros que participan de esta integración. Estamos en un contexto, los años 50, un dato muy importante en el que los que serán Estados miembros de las comunidades europeas están perdiendo sus imperios coloniales. Francia se enfrenta a la guerra de Algeria. Los holandeses acababan de perder Indonesia. Los belgas, el Congo. Y claro, dicen, bueno, pues ¿qué tenemos que hacer? Pues unirnos aquí en Europa, ¿no? En parte para superar estos traumas y para crear un mercado que compense las pérdidas coloniales. Por tanto, esto, que tampoco es una federación, porque la Unión Europea no es una federación, esencialmente no lo es, porque para reformar los tratados constitutivos de la Unión Europea necesitas el consentimiento de todos los Estados miembros de la Unión Europea. En cambio, para reformar la Constitución de los Estados Unidos, pues necesitas solo tres cuartas partes, bueno, además de las 2/3 partes de la Cámara de Representantes y del Senado. Pero bueno, en esta cosa casi federal que podría ser la Unión Europea, también deriva de este pacto entre débiles que están perdiendo sus colonias y que están bajo la amenaza de la Unión Soviética en plena Guerra Fría. Y esta es una constante que, como digo, se repite, y ahora sí que quería acabar pues hablando un poco de España, que al fin de cuentas, en España se forja el Estado de las Autonomías a finales de los 70, pero es esencialmente porque es que no hay otro remedio. Es decir, España está sumida, a la muerte de Franco, está sumida en una crisis económica, como gran parte del mundo occidental, brutal. También está en un proceso de pérdida colonial, que a veces se olvida, pero bueno, se olvida que unos días antes de la muerte de Franco se cede el Sáhara Occidental a Marruecos, en un contencioso que todavía dura hasta nuestros días, que unos años antes se había reconocido la independencia de Guinea Ecuatorial, por tanto perdiendo las posesiones en África, las pocas posesiones ya en ultramar que quedaban, y bueno, ante la presión de los nacionalismos periféricos, al final se acaba cediendo en el reconocimiento de una autonomía política que, como hemos visto, ha sido variable, ha sido de fluctuación variable a lo largo de estos años, y que ahora pues se convierte en el debate entre mantenimiento del status quo, progreso dentro del autonomismo o secesionismo. En fin, para concluir, creo que al analizar cualquier situación territorial, de relación territorial, tendríamos que tener presente esta circunstancia. Con lo cual, pues para Puerto Rico, que a fin de cuentas es de lo que hemos venido a hablar aquí, bueno, pues cualquier cosa que se haga, cualquier decisión que se tome, se tiene que considerar esta correlación de fuerzas. ¿Es el imperio lo suficientemente potente para imponer la solución? ¿Es Puerto Rico lo suficientemente potente para abrir su ruta en solitario? Ambos tienen sus debilidades y se puede llegar a un acuerdo que satisfaga a las dos partes. Bueno, estas serían las cuestiones que les invito a pensar, a reflexionar y a discutir. Muchas gracias.
Bueno, moltes gràcies, Héctor, por el teu contribución. I'm so glad to have you here. I've known you since at least 2009. When the first time I saw you was at your office at the Universidad Pompeu Fabra. You probably think, what is this guy from Puerto Rico doing here? But it also living proof that Catalans can be good friends. In fact, I have been in his house twice in Altafulla, idyllic location. Anytime you want to do a house exchange between my house and your house for a month, we can do it. Right. So now about the two comments for you. Although I'm tempted because I loved your talk. I found it very, very, very stimulating, actually, and we need to talk about this. Very intellectually stimulating. So do you? I'm going to go off the record a little bit. Do you really think then that federalism? There's a long history of Catalans, suggesting federalism for Spain. P. Maragall and Valentí Almiral, many others, I think, and the PSC itself. So, given the overpowering, the power of the center in Spain, so strong, is federalism and federation absolutely impossible for Spain? That'll be the first question. The second is, as you know, in Quebec, Scotland, and Puerto Rico, central states have permitted and tolerated the holding of referendums, right? In Spain, however, this has not been possible, as we all know. And in your view, what is it about the constitutional law, the political culture, the model of state, and the history of Spain that makes this impossible in the case of Spain? That's the second question. The third, as you know, nationalism is young. Most scholars are modernists and would assert that nationalism made its appearance in the world history quite recently, sometime after the French Revolution. In the case of Spain, during much of the 19th century and the 20th century, its nationalism developed in the context of oligarchic and authoritarian regimes, civil war, and the long Franco dictatorship. What do you think is the effect of this history on Spanish nationalism as we know it today? And how would you characterize Spanish nationalism today?
Gracias, Jaime. Vamos a dar paso ahora al diálogo entre los ponentes, pero le quiero recordar que pueden hacer sus preguntas utilizando las tarjetas. Indíquele a los ujieres y las tomaremos al final. I would like to start this dialogue with Professor Smith because I'm intrigued since it relates directly to Puerto Rico. Jaime's question about the meaning of Trumpism, white protectionism, and what does it mean for Puerto Rico and the prospects of statehood?
So Donald Trump's appeal is to those who are nostalgic for an America in which white Christian men governed. And Trump is not himself an old-style white nationalist in the sense that he doesn't propose to go back to the days when you had to be white to be naturalized, or when only whites could vote, or when we had explicit racial segregation. But for the many whites in America who feel that they are losing their economic and cultural position because of the policies of liberals and globalist elites, he does promise to protect them against that loss of status, and that's why we call him a white protectionist. And what does this mean for American democracy and for Puerto Rico? I do think American democracy is in its greatest danger since the Civil War, because there is a real possibility that a substantial part of the country will come to be controlled by members of a party who only regard the results of elections as legitimate if they win. And so they can be genuinely a minority party, and they will never acknowledge that. They'll try and stay in power. Now, that movement may get rejected over the next couple of elections if a more liberal or progressive coalition got national power. They might want to bolster that power by pushing for statehood for Puerto Rico in the hopes or expectations that it would elect, say, 2 Democratic senators. But it's also possible that the Trumpist movement will consolidate power. And if that should happen, the prospects for a change in Puerto Rico's status would not be good. That's not part of making America the way it used to be. But as I tried to bring out, there are those in the Trump nationalist camp who have both partisan reasons and ideological reasons for wanting to give greater recognition and accept some change of status for Puerto Rico if Puerto Ricans were not threatening the dominance of the Trump movement in the U.S., either in elected positions or on the Supreme Court. And that might mean that a very conservative Puerto Rico that might want recognition as a subnation within America's democracy, a state that was a subnation, that might conceivably be acceptable, but only if there was great confidence that Puerto Ricans would support most of all the other positions of the Trump movement. Again, this vision of a white Christian nationalist America. Now, I believe Puerto Ricans are entitled to make any choice that you think best for your futures, but I hope you don't make that one.
Thank you. Who goes next? Professor Fassi?
Thank you. The first question of Jaime relates to the question of the current status of Corsica. Is Corsica already autonomous? No, according to some international texts which are very consensual, Corsica will be autonomous, but like all French local authorities. According to French constitution, Corsica is not autonomous. Only a few overseas authorities are. Corsican authority has not legislative power, no fiscal power, no police power. In fact, it is designed not for government, but for administration. Corsica is not autonomous because autonomy would imply at least the right to adapt national laws to the situation of the island, and it's not the case. It's not the case. The debate today is about this question, and according to me, it will be a huge change for our island. The second question relates to the report of the Professor Van der Master. This report strongly supports the need for debate about legislative autonomy. However, Professor Master does not want to advocate a specific position because she states the choice must be made by the Corsicans elected representatives. It's understandable. She only makes suggestions to improve the current functioning of the institutions and proposes some major hypotheses for the implementation of a future and hypothetical autonomy. And the third question was about the coalition, the links between autonomists and independentists, a very complicated question. The coalition agreement between autonomists and independentists took place in 2015 when it was essential, indispensable for the victory. However, already in 2017, a large part, maybe the majority of the party of Gilles Simeoni no longer support the union with the independentists in the first round. Why? Because since the initial victory, there was a real competition between the autonomist leader, Gilles Simeoni, which leads the executive, and the independentist leader, Jean-Guy Talamon, which presides the assembly for the definition of the agenda and for the definition of the political strategy. This permanent competition was resented by autonomists since their democratic legitimacy was much stronger. In the first round of 2015, Simeoni has obtained 18%, Talamoni only 7%. So there was now another problem. With the rupture of the coalition, competition intensifies. It was very likely, it's sure. This was very likely, and it is a very negative factor for successful discussions with the state.
Thank you. Héctor?
Bueno, sobre el tema del federalismo catalán en España, bueno, lo que hay que decir, y esto tiene un poco de relación con la cuestión quebecoa-canadiense, que claro, si analizamos la historia vemos que a fin de cuentas los catalanes pues hace unos 150 años que mandaron por última vez en España, ¿no? En Canadá ha habido primeros ministros quebequeses, de hecho ahora mismo hay uno. En España, pues el último catalán que fue jefe de Estado y jefe de gobierno, porque era en la época de la Primera República, era precisamente Pi Margall. Claro, además también cabe decir que cuando en las raras excepciones en las que se ha planteado una solución federal para España, como fue en la Primera República, en 1873, pues también España estaba hundida en una crisis tremenda. Se había, unos años antes, en la Revolución de 1868, se había expulsado a la dinastía borbónica, Isabel II, mediante un golpe de Estado propiciado por otro catalán, el general Prim. Después que el general Prim quiso convertir España en una monarquía constitucional e intentó atraer a Amadeo de Saboya, pero Amadeo de Saboya, la casa de los Saboya, pero cuando vieron que también Prim fue asesinado y cuando aterrizó, desembarcó Amadeo de Saboya en España, pues vio como dirían los argentinos, el quilombo que había, pues se fue y entonces llegó la República, pero casi por casualidad, ¿no? La Primera República. Con lo cual, bueno, esto es sintomático, ¿no? De hasta qué punto, mientras que en Quebec los quebecois han participado en la gobernabilidad del conjunto de Canadá, en España los catalanes pues raramente han participado en la gobernabilidad del conjunto de España. Y eso yo supongo que tiene que ver con el modelo territorial del Estado. Y sobre el nacionalismo, el Spanish nationalism en la actualidad, pues, bueno, yo diría que en el fondo está marcado por lo mismo que pasaba en esta época. Es decir, por una idea de la unidad territorial que casi trasciende elementos políticos y jurídicos, que casi va a un plano religioso. Es como una dogmática de la unidad nacional indivisible que tiene pues, sus raíces en la unidad religiosa, en el catolicismo, en el baluarte del catolicismo, España como el baluarte del catolicismo, que hunde sus raíces en el periodo de la Contrarreforma, y de alguna manera continúa impregnando las situaciones políticas del presente, ¿no? La unidad de destino en lo universal, que decía José Antonio Primo de Rivera, el fascismo, pero continúa participando, por ejemplo, de una determinada interpretación de la unidad tal como se reconoce constitucionalmente y es interpretada por el Tribunal Constitucional actual. Claro, que esto sería la antítesis de un pacto federal. Si uno revisa la jurisprudencia del Tribunal Constitucional Español desde sus orígenes, verá que a lo que tienen alergia es justamente a lo que se planteaba en la época de la Primera República, ¿no? Que España fuese el resultado de un pacto entre iguales. Y esto, que era un poco el federalismo agregativo, ¿no? Y esto yo creo que es una pesadilla y lo continúa siendo para una concepción unitarista, casi, como digo, más anclada en la religión que en la realidad. Claro, frente a este unitarismo a ultranza, claro, al final lo que ocurre es que se acaba desembocando en el secesionismo, ¿no? Porque yo seguramente, bueno, y durante mucho tiempo se continuaba pensando desde Cataluña que la solución federal era posible. Pero claro, para la solución federal necesitas un margen de negociación que no se ve por ninguna parte. Y de alguna forma no se ve por ninguna parte porque desde el centro se parte de unos presupuestos que no se pueden negociar. Esta sería la conclusión.
Muchísimas gracias. Vamos a empezar ahora con las preguntas. Voy a empezar con una for Professor Smith, and I'm going to choose it because it brings a topic that Sergio brought up when we were at the beginning discussing the type of themes that we would bring in this conference. The question is this: did Vaelo Madero uphold Puerto Rico's colonial status, or did it reaffirm that citizenship does not equate to fair and or equal treatment? And it brings us to the concept of differentiated citizenship that you brought up, Sergio, at the very beginning of our conversation. So if you could comment on that.
So I think it does both. I think that on the one hand, it clearly did not challenge the constitutional understandings going back to the insular cases that the Constitution as a whole does not apply in full force to Puerto Rico or the other American territories. Congress can extend some provisions, and a very few provisions, like the Due Process Clause, are so fundamental that they do apply, even if Congress hasn't acted. But if they apply, what does that mean for citizenship? Here I have a little bit of a complicated position because I think that the reality is that if you look at the citizenship laws of the United States or any other country, you will find that they have always been vastly differentiated. There are all kinds of different statuses. I like to point that when I became 65 in Philadelphia, I could ride on public transportation for free. Other citizens couldn't, you know. That's a kind of differentiated citizenship. We have a vast array of differentiations in citizenship. But many of the differentiations are invidious. Many of the differentiations create forms of lesser citizenship, not appropriate accommodations to the differences people experience. And especially on economic issues, we do have a tradition in America in the name of freedom of allowing severe inequalities to persist in ways that deprive people of the resources that they really need to experience themselves as full and equal citizens. And many of the interpretations of the Due Process Clause and what the court takes to be its equal protection component, as well as other constitutional provisions, do perpetuate these economic inequalities, which are one form and a harsh form of differentiated citizenship.
Question says that Benedict Anderson famously described a nation as an imagined political community. Is Puerto Rico really part of the U.S. imagined community nation from the perspective of U.S. citizens? Are we even on the radar?
Unfortunately, Puerto Rico was part of an imagined community of the United States at the time of the Spanish-American War, when the vision of the United States, embraced by all too many American leaders, was that the Americans were the highest and divinely favored members of the white race that had a mission to rule over others and maybe elevate them up to our level if they proved up to it, or maybe just rule them. And I'm afraid that Puerto Ricans were put into that picture as those who America had a divine mission to rule over. There's a famous speech by Senator Albert Beveridge proclaiming this mission that is very much a vision of imagined community in which Puerto Ricans have a place. Now, in the struggles for greater human rights and equality that occurred through the 20th century, this vision was discredited in the American imagination, and I think it's fair to say that Puerto Ricans then got pushed to the margin of the visions of American community. And certainly the nostalgia for a white Christian nation that the Trump movement represents doesn't have any vivid place for Puerto Ricans. It is true, however, though, that we've always had multiple different imaginations of America, and there have been versions in which many Americans have celebrated Puerto Ricans as people who bring an enriching diversity to the American political community. There is a basis for strengthening that kind of imagining of America, but it has always been a highly contested vision, and I'm afraid we're in a fairly harsh stage of that contestation at present.
Thank you. This question is for Professor Fossey. It is said that Puerto Rico really does not obtain the necessary attention from the United States because you're only, and this is a quote, mosquito in the back of the United States. Corsica has only 350,000 people, inhabitants. Are they really heard in mainland France? Is Corsica similar to Martinique?
No, I think the situation of overseas authorities is more bad than Corsica. Corsica, with respect to his demographics, is essentially a marginal part of national politics. It's sure, and it's a problem. We always have the sentiment to being ignored by the rest of France, and it is not a simple sentiment. Yeah, it's a reality.
Thank you so much. Any more questions from the public? Thank you so much for our panelists. Vamos a pasar ahora a nuestro próximo segmento. ¿Ah? Vamos a ver. La diáspora.
Y usted mencionó que muchos nacionales de Córcega están fuera de Córcega. Entonces quería preguntar cuál es la participación de las luchas nacionales de Córcega de esos que están fuera de Córcega.
Gracias. No soy fluent in Spanish too. No in English, no in Spanish. Creo que la conciencia nacional de los corsos sea muy inferior a la conciencia nacional de los puertorriqueños, estoy seguro. Initially, the regionalism in the 1960s had very strong origins in Paris. In the sector of students, in particular, yes. These students, these intellectuals had a very interesting impact at the intellectual level, but at the level of the discussions with the government, this impact was really weak. The higher impact is found in Corsica, and we will regret it. The violent episodes were the most powerful impacts on French government.
Thank you so much. Thank you to our panelists. Vamos a pasar ahora a la próxima sección. Le damos las gracias. ¿Qué quiere decir todo esto que hemos escuchado? ¿Qué lecciones podemos derivar para Puerto Rico? ¿Cuáles sobre Estados Unidos y los mecanismos que pueden forjarse o no para abordar el estatus de Puerto Rico? Vamos a pasar entonces a una reflexión final. Vamos a pasar ahora a una reflexión final con Sergio de CNE y otra vez el profesor André Lecours. Adelante.
So we come at the end of the conference here. It's been a very interesting set of presentations. And I have a couple of questions for you, but before we get into that, I would like to get your impression as to what impacted you the most, what you thought was interesting, what was particularly intellectually attractive from what you heard today.
Yeah. Well, I guess my first sense is that I think there's some validation to Jaime's proposal at the beginning of the conference this morning in suggesting that there's an alternative paradigm, an alternative understanding of Puerto Rico that lies in the literature that political scientists know about minority nations, stateless nations, right? And as he indicated in his slide, and I think we saw in these other cases today, a lot of these parallels, right? Communities, first of all, that implicitly or explicitly use the language of the nation, right? Communities that are divided on the exact status they wish to have, right? So Puerto Rican politics, just like politics in Corsica, in Scotland, in Catalonia, in Quebec, is not only divided along kind of self-determination options, but it's also structured by this, right? Including in political parties. And so I think all the similarities are there. I mean, there are peculiarities to Puerto Rico, of course. To me, there's the island nature of it as well, which I think there's some similarities with Corsica, I think, at first glance, right? And islandness, the nature of the economic relationships with the mainland. So even when there are differences, I think we can find some cases where we do see connection between Puerto Rico and some of these other cases.
I did find very interesting your analysis as to, how in Canada, when the discussion moved away from formal amendments to the Constitution, it created a space for Quebec and the central government to negotiate these intergovernmental pacts, which in a way are somewhat similar to the covenant that was done with Scotland in a sense, right? It was not part of a formal, legislative process. It was more of a negotiation, right, between the two entities. And what gives rise to what kind of institutions give rise to that kind of dynamic that allows for those intergovernmental pacts outside from formal constitutional amendments?
I don't know if it's institutions. I think it's political will at the end of the day, right? And sometimes constitutionally things are too hard to achieve because there are too many actors, too many veto players, actually, we could say, right?
Or it may be just too difficult to amend the Constitution.
Exactly, right? Some requirements are very high. And I think here in Puerto Rico, I mean, politically, there's been this idea over decades that, the ELA could be, bolstered, amplified, right? Although I know that in the U.S. it's kind of suggested that's probably not kind of something that's constitutional. So sometimes the Constitution offers, unfortunately, I think, some limits and some obstacles as to what can be done. Again, I think it's, and I'll come back to some of the themes that were discussed at the university yesterday and some of the themes also in some kind of recent books on these topics. I think it's important for these, minority nations to be able to discuss and to negotiate their collective future with the state, right? Whether that's constitutionally or not, right?
Okay. And I've read your paper. I know you didn't have time to go over all your concepts, but a very interesting distinction you made in your analysis is, and you applied to Quebec, and I thought it was interesting, you make a differentiation between what you call static autonomies and dynamic autonomies. And your thesis is basically, if I understood correctly, that when you have a very static kind of autonomy where people don't see a future for it being amended or for it to grow, that generates pro-independence secessionist movements. And the opposite happens when you have a very elastic, dynamic kind of autonomic system. Have you ever seen in your studies a case where you have a static autonomy where instead of generating support for independence, it generates support for federalism, for integrating more with the core, with the center? Have you ever seen that?
Yeah, that's what you're suggesting in relation to Puerto Rico.
In a way, yeah, diplomatically, yes.
But I think that could be an interpretation of it, right? The sense that if you, there's a couple of views on this. There's one that I've expressed before, and that, maybe because of the public debates around status in Puerto Rico, the multiple referendums that, even natives of here lose count of, I guess, that I suspect that maybe it contributes to a perception right or wrong, that things can change. That's really up for Puerto Ricans to decide. They could change things tomorrow if they wanted to. It's just that they don't agree on which way to go. That's one view. And then the other view that I think you might have suggested, and I heard it yesterday too, I found that really interesting, is that, maybe the fact that autonomy in Puerto Rico has not changed objectively since 1952, it's been objectively static, it's led to the other option to the status quo, which here is statehood rather than independence, right? And that is a peculiarity of Puerto Rico, right? That you have this option that is, becoming a constituent unit of a federation, right? And it's, again, it's related to the nature of ELA and the fact that, it doesn't have to be independence or the status quo here in Puerto Rico. There's this other option that appear to be at least politically possible.
At least in theory, yes. But given traditional, American political culture and what really is a very strong sense of nationalism in the state, and Jaime and I have talked about this. I mean, American nationalism is so strong that it's almost invisible, right? It's almost taken for granted.
I agree.
Right? Even though, now with, Trump and the entire Trumpist discourse, it has come to the forefront. Even before Trump, it was assumed that the United States was a nation. Who constituted part of that nation has been subject to a lot of debate and even a civil war. How do you see a very strong, symmetric federal union like the United States evolving? If it's possible at all, first of all, for it to evolve and become more asymmetric in the sense that Canada is, or do you think that possibility is foreclosed in the case of the United States, given the current political situation?
Well, I mean, I won't say that things are foreclosed, and to me, it's not even linked to the current political situation. I think one of the lessons, if we're trying to draw lessons here from all these other cases in Puerto Rico and then the other way around, I think one of the lessons from all these other cases is that it's hard for states to acknowledge national diversity, to acknowledge multinationalism, right? It's difficult. It's extremely difficult in Spain. It's not done in Spain, right? In Canada, it's really difficult. That's why we don't put in the Constitution, because that's seen as being too important. We'll do it a little bit politically, and some politicians here or there will mention the Quebec nation, but not very often. It's still controversial. And then in the UK, it's more politically done, but now we see there are some limits, right? Because, as Nicola said earlier, maybe the British government was okay with an independence referendum when it pretty much knew it was going to win it, but now it's less okay with it, right? So I guess, I think there's a maybe not a lesson, but something to think about here in terms of the statehood option, right? What would that look like? Can the United States federation, to use Jaime's terms there from the slide, can it be multinational? Right? The state might now be multinational sociologically because of the territories, but obviously that hasn't entered the American consciousness. I think for most Americans, the notion that there's many different nations in the U.S. probably might be hard to grasp. So if Puerto Rico were to become a state, how would that be understood? Right? Could most Americans understand that Puerto Rico would be not only a state but a nation? Or would Puerto Ricans be maybe ready to accept that maybe that's not going to be understood? So if Puerto Rico is going to be a state, maybe it's going to be just that, a state, right?
Although, I understand what you're saying, but I think we also make a mistake here in Puerto Rico by treating all 50 states as homogeneous, and that's not true. If you live in the United States, there are certain differences. They may not rise to the level where people self-identify as a nation, perhaps with the exception of the Native American tribes, which are a very special case within the American polity. But I do think it's going to be very difficult, given my experience and what I have studied about the United States, for the federal government in the United States to accept Puerto Rico as a distinct political, entity within the union with full rights. However, that does leave the option. So what do we do then? I mean, what we have, I think there's at least a slight majority. If you look at the 2012 voting here in Puerto Rico, 54% of the people are not content with the status quo. So what are the options then? If statehood is partially or completely foreclosed for now, greater autonomy seems incredibly difficult within the U.S. polity right now for everything that has been mentioned today. So that leaves us with independence, but and then bringing professors, Professor from Barcelona, his theory about federalism as a factor of the states. Is the United States sufficiently weak or Puerto Rico sufficiently strong to support a significant independence movement? From outside, how do you see it?
Well, I mean, from outside, I guess I see that there's not a lot of support for independence in Puerto Rico, right?
Well, I would question that, actually.
Okay.
I would say that if you look only at the elections every 4 years for who is elected governor, I don't think that's a good proxy. I don't think that's a good indication. I think there are a lot of people that identify themselves as pro-independence but do not necessarily vote for the independence candidate for governor. So that does not necessarily mean they're a majority, but it's probably larger. It's a larger group than what a lot of people think. And that obviously complicates the analysis, right? Because you don't have a clear 51% majority in favor of independence. Which brings me to another question, though, which I thought was interesting in the case of Brexit. Brexit won by a bare minimum, if you look at,
Sure.
And yet that was considered sufficient for the UK to actually commence the process, right? In other instances where you have seen similar referenda, is just 51% enough to achieve any kind of change, or do you really need what people call a supermajority for any of the options that may be available?
Well, those are some of the pitfalls of independence referenda, right? Is agreeing on the rules, and I mean, in Canada, twice we've proceeded with the assumption that 50% plus one could trigger a secession, but that has since been somewhat qualified, at least on the federal side, by federal legislation stipulating that the question needed to be clear and the majority needed to be clear. But again, Quebec politicians and institutions have not agreed to that. So there's a challenge there, right, in the mechanism of the referendum, first of all, which, in the case of Puerto Rico and the United States, I'm not sure that the American state, the U.S. government would have a very strong interest maybe in kind of raising the threshold for a majority. I think that might be more of a debate between political forces here. And then once you agree on these rules, I mean, comes the issue of, you were mentioning support for independence. In these referenda, in these referendum campaigns, there's some familiar questions and issues that come up, a lot of them linked to the economic consequences of independence, citizenship, right? So I think those would be some important costs potentially for Puerto Ricans, obviously, to go going in that direction, right? If only looking at citizenship on the one hand and kind of the economics of it on the other hand, right?
I thought Professor Smith's analysis was quite interesting in terms of how nobody ever thinks about, how Puerto Rico could have an opportunity to become a state given, the nationalism, the turn that American politics have taken over the last 6-8 years. during the Trump administration. It's yet there's a case to be made that to the extent that both the federal, the Supreme Court advocates, keeps insisting on this interpretation of the Constitution based on original public understanding, the history and tradition of the nation as the guide to interpreting the Constitution. It is true that before the insular cases, Congress treated territories differently from the states, but the big difference was that there was an implicit promise that statehood will be granted eventually, right? If you look, even if you go all the way back to 1787 to the Northwest Ordinance, it's very clear that Congress states, you have to reach certain population, you have to organize a government, you have to have, a viable economy, and when you do all those things, you can come back to us and then ask us for statehood. Whether or not that promise wasn't ever enforceable is a different question, but the implicit promise was there. What changed with the insular cases, or at least one of the things that changed with the insular cases, we also forget, these are basically 20, 25 opinions, depending who you ask, is that that promise implicit of becoming a state was removed in the case of the Philippines, Cuba, Puerto Rico, basically due to racial motives. So it's interesting that a lot of people here in Puerto Rico focus on the insular cases, and your point that, well, what if they're overturned and nothing really changes? Because Congress still has all these powers for Puerto Rico under a separate section of the Constitution, right? Under the territorial clause. It certainly will not mean that Puerto Rico will become a state. And it certainly will not mean that Puerto Ricans will have presidential vote. So it will be basically a continuation in many ways of the current status.
And I think, if I may, I think it shows a little bit, again, the limits of that, I guess in my opinion, overly legalistic approach to Puerto Rico that dominates, right? Because if we do a bit of a counterfactual here and examine the likelihood of, changes to the insular cases, which in fact might not lead to any actual political changes at all, then I think, that means that there's room for, more political analyses of Puerto Rico. And I think I would add also, because I mean, as a Canadian, one of the things that I guess I think Puerto Rico is very useful for is to understand, what the ELA model is and what it could mean in other contexts, because politicians in the Basque Country, in Spain, for example, have, in the early 2000s, used the exact word, the Estado Libre Asociado, in trying to think about different models. Now, I don't think they knew very much, right, about the actual Puerto Rican ELA, but they used the term, though. And in Quebec, we've had those kinds of very similar terms, sovereignty, association, right? So it kind of referred conceptually to something that, at least in law, I guess, exists here. So I think there's a usefulness in blending Puerto Rico with some of these other cases, so that, both political scientists, other social scientists, and also politicians maybe understand a little bit more, a little bit better, right? What autonomy involves here in Puerto Rico, what it doesn't involve and what it involves, right?
What the limits are and what
exactly
it benefits maybe.
Like, I don't think, for example, when the Basque President Linda Cari was talking about that, I don't think he envisioned the fiscal board appointed by the Spanish government.
And I don't think anybody here in Puerto Rico envisioned that either, to be honest, until it happened. So yes, I mean, these concepts are very elastic, right? That's one of the dangers of the autonomic option, right? It's
true.
It could benefit you, or it could be to your detriment. It could go both ways. Another case where actually Puerto Rico was mentioned a long time ago was for the Palestinian territories.
Okay.
It was used. I remember meeting a scholar from Israel. She was in Washington studying different types of autonomies, and she asked me a couple of questions one day over lunch about Puerto Rico, and she said, we think this could be a viable option, and that totally threw me off. She said, well, that's interesting. I never thought about that. So I guess there's some interesting parallels there.
But on that, sometimes the link also is the sheer terminological link with territory. I just as an anecdote, I have a colleague who works on Canadian territories. We have 3 of them, And when he tells people he works on the territories, they're like, oh, Gaza or the West Bank? No, I work on Canadian territories. So that's another angle. It's not really...
And what is the status of those territories formally?
Formally, they are creatures of the federal parliament. So it's somewhat reminiscent of the American territories, actually. And there's almost no academic work comparing the two. Like there's 1 or 2 articles. I guess for us, it's the Canadian territories are really sparsely populated, and there's also the added consideration that there 2 out of 3 of them have majority indigenous populations. But again, they are not constituent units of the Canadian Federation, just like American territories.
They are under the direct governance.
With autonomy, but yes.
Yes,
but it's an autonomy that's, I guess, for lack of a better term, devolved. It's not constitutional. Can be taken back and can be, at least constitutionally speaking, amended by the federal parliament alone.
I have a question about the Quebec case in particular.
Sure.
I mean, Quebec is, as I understand it, it's a full member of the Canadian Federation, and yet there's very strong nationalist movement there that divides between autonomism and independence. And according to your presentation, autonomism has been increasing. In those instances where powers have been transferred or negotiated or devolved to Quebec, has the federal government honored those pacts? Are they still binding? Are they still in place? Have they been honored by the other provinces too?
Yeah, so typically, let's say Quebec wants more powers in a specific policy fields. Currently, it's a lot immigration. So the federal government will typically ask all provinces if they're interested in more powers on this issue. Now, again, typically the 9 other provinces will say, no, we're comfortable if the federal government runs the immigration system. And it's important to know because, to understand this, because the federal government doesn't want to, I guess, appear as if Quebec is too distinct in a sense. No, we've offered it to everybody. But only Quebec feels that it's important that it control its own immigration system, right? And from there, typically the Quebec and the federal government will strike a bilateral agreement. They typically have a term limit. They often involve transfer of money, right? Because if the Quebec government does most of the work, instead of the federal government, they need some financial compensation. So yeah, I mean, they're always honored, but they have a time limit. So then they're renegotiated, right? Okay. They're always up for new renegotiation.
I didn't know that.
And that's kind of what I mean when I say that, the Constitution in Canada has been really static. It hasn't moved. It gives the impression that the country's stuck. But these intergovernmental agreements, they're always, some of them are longer terms, right? They can go to 5 or even more years. But they're regularly renegotiated, right? And they can be done bilaterally. And for the Quebec government, that's kind of important and useful because you said, the Quebec is a province. So constitutionally, it's 1 out of 10. But politically, for Quebecers, they feel like they're 1 out of 2.
I see.
There's Quebec and there's the rest of Canada, which is primarily English speaking. So of course, the difference between 1 out of 10 and 1 out of 2 is huge.
Yeah,
right?
of course. Yeah, of course.
And these types of intergovernmental agreements, especially when they're bilateral in nature, I think give life to this sense that, okay, this is a discussion, a negotiation between Quebec and the federal government who kind of speaks for the whole country, but I guess especially for the rest of Canada in that context. So, that's interesting to think about for Puerto Rico as well, because in a sense, statehood would mean a bit of a transition from being, 1-on-1 to 1 of 50, I guess, right?
Well, putting it one-on-one, it's very
I
nice of you. It's really, it's more like the federal government and then Puerto Rico does whatever, with certain exceptions.
I mean,
of course.
there's a major power gap, but it's still the notion that I guess there's there's two parties to ELA, right? In principle. Right?
In principle,
Yeah.
yes. And then there's Congress that decides to. That's an interesting. The reason I bring the question of the PACs is because in the case of Puerto Rico, in theory, yes, Congress created a home rule, scheme for Puerto Rico in 1952. But as you know, the jurisdiction of the federal government has increased significantly over the last 50 years. So there are a lot of areas that were not subject to legislation by the federal government in the United States in 1950, 1952,
of course.
And now they are. And Puerto Rico doesn't have a say on any of that, on whether any of those new laws that are enacted. And I think that's why the notion of asymmetric citizenship that the Jaime has written about is very interesting. Puerto Ricans are citizens, and I think this is a big difference with several of the cases we studied today. But if you look at the bundle of rights that come with that citizenship, it's interesting because in terms of civil rights and protections against, unreasonable searches and seizures, equal protection of the law, we're essentially basically treated like a state. In terms of political rights, we basically have none. We don't vote for president. We don't have any senators. We have a non-voting representative in Congress. And then in the middle, we are treated sometimes like a state and sometimes differently for different, federal economic programs. Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, SSI, depending on whatever Congress is thinking. So that's a very odd arrangement, right? You're full, quote unquote, full U.S. citizen. And in fact, if I take a plane to Miami, which is 2 hours away, I enjoy all the rights of the citizens. But if I decide to stay here, I don't. Have you ever seen any other case in your experience when you're studying other similar situations where you have that kind of differentiated citizenship? Not only the status of the territorial government vis-a-vis the federal government or the central government, but in terms of the nature of the citizenship itself.
Yeah, no, that's a distinctive trait for sure. The fact that, as you said, a Puerto Rican can move to the continental U.S. and then acquire kind of full political and social rights, I think is a significant difference, right? Between all these other cases. And it also brings in the question of the diaspora as well, right? Because, of course, a lot of Puerto Ricans have chosen to do that. And so, there's the political aspect of Puerto Ricans in the continental U.S. that really doesn't find much of an equivalent anywhere else, right?
And to your knowledge, do you know of any former colonial power that granted full citizenship to colonial subjects while they were still, under the colonial regime?
Yeah, I guess my instinct as a Canadian is to think of Indigenous peoples in Canada, actually, which were not full citizens, didn't have the right to vote till the 1960s, right? And so they had this kind of partial citizenship, but yeah, I think overall it's kind of a very distinctive trait. And again, I think the diaspora, I don't know, maybe you can tell me a little bit about this. Is the diaspora, I mean, they must be differentiated too in Puerto Ricans in the U.S. in terms of their support for different options, but I know that there's some prominent kind of, Puerto Rican politicians in the U.S. Of Puerto Rican descent anyway, who some favor independence, other favor statehood. Can you tell me a little bit about how the diaspora plays in
there's been, it's a whole spectrum. In the United States. And same in Congress, those Puerto Ricans that have managed to get elected to Congress, Jennifer Gonzalez favored statehood for many years. Nidia Velázquez favored some sort of autonomic relationship. Former Representative Gutierrez favored independence. So the Puerto Rican community has become a lot more active after Joaquin Maria, I must say, and a lot more vocal too, especially because we were treated so badly by the Trump administration. Whether or not they will have a real impact on state elections in places like Florida, it remains to be seen, but there are certainly people working on that. Unfortunately, we are reaching the end. I see Jennifer standing up. Thank you, Professor Leclerc, for your time, and thank you to all the panelists today for sharing your research and knowledge with us. And Jennifer?
Thank you so much, Sergio and Professor Leclerc.
Thank you.
I want to thank the panelists for traveling so far and sharing this morning with us. Esta mañana ha sido de muchísimos aprendizajes. Yo me voy también con muchísimas preguntas, muchas inquietudes. Esperamos que esto haya sido igual de interesante para ustedes y que quieran continuar con la conversación, con las preguntas y con seguir pensando este tema. No nos vamos a despedir sin antes traer al podio al presidente de CNE, Mike Sotoclas.
90 segundos solamente. Yo sé que todos están hambrientos y con deseos de estirarnos un poco ya, pero no quería dejarlos ir sin primero darle las gracias a ustedes por habernos acompañado hoy en este evento, un evento no tradicional, así que le doy las gracias por eso. Quiero darle las gracias a Jaime, que fue realmente el autor intelectual de toda esta conferencia y lo ha hecho por mucho tiempo. Quiero darle las gracias también a Jennifer, porque ella también trabajó mucho en esto. Jennifer es, como ustedes saben, la que dirige nuestro asentamiento ultramar para mantener el glosario que estamos utilizando. Gracias a los panelistas, que todos son de un renombre muy prestigioso y global. Thank you very much to all of the panelists. We really appreciate the fact that you've come from so far to share so much with us today. Y algunos de ustedes saben que CNE el año que viene cumplimos 25 años desde que nos fundamos. Y por mucho tiempo nos pidieron y nos pedían y nos piden que entráramos en este tema de estatus, pero ni locos nos íbamos a meter en esto. En Puerto Rico es algo que es muy difícil, es muy controversial, como decía Jennifer, trae mucho ánimo. Pero yo creo que lo que estamos haciendo obviamente no está funcionando. Lo que se está trabajando en cuanto a estatus en Puerto Rico no está dando frutos y por lo tanto pensé que ya era hora de entrar, y me recuerda una cita de Keynes que a mí me gusta mucho, que dice que la dificultad no yace tanto en desarrollar nuevas ideas, sino en escapar de las viejas. Y yo creo que este es un caso que se asemeja mucho en eso. Y hicimos lo que siempre hacemos, le aplicamos a este tema, a este reto, las herramientas y los valores de CNE, que son enfoque en lo empírico, alto rigor intelectual y transparencia, y con Puerto Rico como nuestra única agenda. Y por eso quisimos, como Jennifer también estableció desde el principio, no venimos con una agenda particular, no venimos a favorecer una solución o una posición. Esa no es la manera en que nosotros trabajamos, pero sí queremos aplicarle empiricismo y alto rigor intelectual para elevar este debate e informar lo que está sucediendo. Más aún, como ustedes vieron hoy, este no es un tema que es único de Puerto Rico, así que decidimos hacer algo también que es radical en nuestra isla, y es mirar hacia afuera, algo que no es muy común para nosotros. Y por eso quisimos traer a personas que están trabajando el mismo tema o temas similares, pero desde otros lugares, y que también lo han estado haciendo por mucho tiempo. Y creo que ha sido muy beneficioso para nosotros. Yo espero que hoy sea el comienzo de una nueva conversación sobre el estatus de Puerto Rico, y que haya servido más que nada para inspirar nuevas ideas, nuevos caminos, y especialmente inspirar a los estudiantes, muchos de los cuales tenemos aquí con nosotros hoy, que inspire a estos estudiantes y a otros jóvenes que tenemos dentro de nuestro grupo. Así que le doy las gracias por estar con nosotros hoy. Aprecio mucho siempre el respaldo de ustedes a lo que estamos haciendo y en particular hoy que tenemos este tema tan nuevo para nosotros. Muchas gracias y nos vemos pronto.